Welcome in. We're gonna do a real quick hand cam. Sorry, let me turn this down a little bit. Hi, welcome. Good evening. We're gonna do a really quick hand cam because I have gotten a few subs, donos, comms since the last time I've done this. So we're just gonna do a quick update with them. Hi, welcome, good evening, hello. We got a couple more. And I like doing these on stream with everyone, so. Unfortunately, no fancy nails. We're giving my nails a break so that they can heal up a little bit and rest because I have not so great nail genetics. But we did get a few more. So thank you, everyone that has commissioned or donated or subscribed. It is greatly appreciated. Thank you. Oh. It's like something sticky on my desk. But how are you? How was your day, your evening? Welcome in, welcome in. We will, I know it's been a month, so maybe people don't remember, but good tidings, excellent. We started a story, or like a series, I guess, last time I did an ASMR reading. And there was still so many more parts to it that I know we still have a few chapters of it left. And I do want to finish it because it really was striking my interest of where it was going. This like weird anomalous apartment building. And then our main character, our main gal, I'm assuming lady based on like the information given to us, her partner had died pretty immediately after moving in. She found these like notes from the last tenant that was there, noting like, don't talk to this guy no matter what he says, don't let these people in, if you see XYZ thing, like this is how you would deal with it. Here's like these weird rules in the building, stuff like that. And she tried to follow them as closely as she could when she had found, oh Jesus, when she had found those notes. Unfortunately, it was too late for her fiance, boyfriend, whoever, I don't remember his relation, but like they were partners at the very minimum. Unfortunately, it's too late for him, so he got got by the creatures that live in the elevator. Question mark. And now I think we're at the point where the tenants in the building are sort of divided in like they either want to help and get rid of these weird like, or like help manage these like anomalies and these creatures, and the other half is just kind of like, no, like they've been here for forever, this is what it is, and like we should not bother them, just let them be. She's obviously on the side of we should deal with these things because they're not natural and they're inhibiting our well-being of living in this apartment or this complex, whatever. And it got to the point where she found the old tenant, tried to sort of understand more about the building through her, and learned that you can get the boyfriend back at a cost. And she learned that because the tenant, who's an older woman, had lost her granddaughter this similar way that she had lost her partner. And so she got her granddaughter back, the old woman, at a cost. Yeah, $12.99, not on clearance. Just up front. I don't like how this is like sitting. No, the cost was that you have to do something with the elevator creatures that would be worthy of a trade at a certain time frame, because they're only active during this certain time frame, which is like 2 or 3 a.m., something like that. It's weird. And I think we were at the point where the MC was like, I'm willing to do anything. I've seen what happens when you try to get someone back. It's worth the risk. And I think that's where it was left off at. So we're gonna jump back into that story. For anyone watching as a VOD on YouTube, everything is in the description below. There will be links and credits to the authors, because everyone deserves to have credit to the things that they create. Oops, sorry, I bumped my glasses against the mic. Oops. Assuming that we don't have too much of that story left, because it is quite long. I think last time we read like 8 or 9 chapters of it. Assuming that this one doesn't have too much more, I do have another story lined up, just in case. But if it does, then so be it. But thank you. We have so many pretty colorful stars. We actually do have like a good amount. It actually does get past the quarter line mark, which or the, I guess, the 100 milliliter mark on this little jar, which is about right above my finger right here. It does actually come up to there, so we do have quite a lot of stars. So thank you everyone that has contributed. Greatly appreciated. Say goodbye to my hands. It will now be going over to... not my hands. Where's my... there it is. Hi. Oh. Where's all my shit? Oh, there it is. Hi. It's not a real stream without scuff, am I right? Let me pop on my reading glasses. How's the music, by the way? Is it too loud? Too soft? Good enough? Oh, there's music. Okay, it's a little quiet. Yeah, it kind of fades in and out, but I can turn it up. It's too quiet. I'll put it like right there, because I don't want to be competing with my voice. It's meant to be very quiet. Anyway, let me get to this person's thing. This letter? Oh, what the? I'm so glad that I haven't started reading yet. So another siren pops by. Okay. Anyway, I don't remember what number part we're at. I know that it's just very long, but we continue. So this story that we're continuing is called "The Previous Tenant of My New Flat Left a Survival Guide." And then the part is, "It's time to end this," and it's from newtownJAM. newtotownJAM. God damn it. I cannot lift my own audio, it is at maximum. We're just gonna... I'll live with the music being too quiet. It's meant for ambiance. Anyway. Wish... This is 5 years ago. Oh, it's gonna be a lot of scrolling. Okay, anyway. Fucking zoom in here. My blind ass. Alright. It's time to end this madness. When I saw her out the window, garden shears being gripped by both hands and a maniacal expression on her face, I just stood still. I was frozen to the spot in shock. I felt no pain at all from the burn on my face. Everything was numb. The relief of eradicating the imposter neighbors and the joy at finding a friend in Derek has hacked away in an instant. Just like every leaf from my shrubs. Why would she do this? What have I ever done to her? Every question possible crossed my mind. I could feel the frustration bubbling inside me. Everything about this place just threw up question after question, and for every answer I got, there were 10 new questions waiting to be asked. At that moment in time, though, only one was truly important. How did Prudence know? I thought about Terry and her telephone conversations. I didn't want to think that the sweet lady I thought Terry had turned out to be would do that, but it did cross my mind. I thought of Ian the postman. I had bad vibes from him for a while. Maybe he'd seen Derek coming up the stairs while on his rounds that morning. I stood there frozen, pondering all these things until I saw Prudence collapse onto the memorial bench sobbing, head in her hands. She was surrounded by the remains of my attempt at a garden, with the shears laid out on the floor. The stairs were kind to me on the way down. It took 4 flights to make it to the bottom. I ran down the corridor and out the back entrance of the block. No idea what I was going to say. "Prudence!" was all I could manage. "Nice one, cat." She sat bolt upright before turning and standing quicker than I thought it possible for an old lady. "You evil, stupid little girl! Do you have any idea what you've done?" she screamed. So much animation in her face that the spaces between her wrinkles pulsated like veins on an angry weightlifter. "Me? You think I'm evil? You left that shitty note hidden, missing everything I need to know, and got my boyfriend killed. And what are you doing to your own?" I screamed, tears beginning to roll before she interrupted me. "Don't you dare talk about her!" Her voice cracked as she broke down again, this time falling to her knees, twigs and leaves sticking to the bottom of her dress. I didn't know what else to do, so I sat down on the floor. I knew it was probably a bad idea. This woman couldn't be trusted, and I hadn't forgotten that. But seeing an old lady crying on the cement floor still made me feel awful. "How did you know about the garden?" I asked her calmly, trying to change my approach. She shoved a crumpled up piece of paper into my hand. She didn't look at me. Her eyes remained on the floor. "Dear Prudence, I couldn't exist knowing what I'd done. I should have never told you about it. The last two won't grow stronger. She was never theirs to begin with. But I have to end her suffering. I'm sorry. Signed, Derek." I knew what he had done as soon as I'd finished the note. Lila, or what was left of her, was gone for good. All of the creatures only Jamie's killers from the lift remained. That's how Derek had spent the few hours I'd slept between our encounters. "This is all your fault," she sniffed. "My whole family are gone because of you." That hurt a lot. I trembled as I tried to speak, but I always really hated confrontation, and I could feel myself starting to glitch. How could you say that? I saw her. She was trapped in a tiny cage eating dog food and small animals. Your family died in that lift. Just like my Jamie. May have struggled to get out my words, but I wasn't about to let Prudence Hemmings blame me for her decisions. Lila was better off dead than what she was, however awful that may sound. What happened to your face? Prudence growled at me. Take you to visit floor number 9? He did this to her in the first place, not me. And now he's disfigured you. She was spinning things. I could feel throbbing as she mentioned my face. I really should have had medical attention. Oh, hi, Coping Cat. This isn't his fault. You messed him up and he did that to her because of you. You told me that yourself. I tried ferociously to defend Derek, but something inside me still felt uncomfortable about what he had done. I couldn't help it. Lila was an innocent little girl who shouldn't have been punished for Prue's mistakes. This whole thing was such a mess. I was grieving. And then I had her back for all those years, and then I lost Bernie. And then I lost my home, and now I have to grieve for her all over again. Prudence continued to cry, but softer. I looked around at the chaos she created and up at the block my boyfriend had died in, and rolled my eyes in disbelief that she could be so selfish. She continued. Let me tell you about Lila. She was a beautiful little girl. As I mentioned before, I have 2 other older children. They've had many other grandchildren. However, I haven't spoken to my eldest 2 in years, even before what happened with Lila. Lila was my first opportunity to get to know one of my grandchildren. Bernie adored her too, always reading her stories and sneaking her sweets. I begged my son to allow her to stay. My children were all incredibly ungrateful. They had it easy growing up and still resented me. I gave them a good strict upbringing, but they didn't appreciate it. They said I was a cruel mother. Lila's dad was the only one I spoke to, but our relationship still wasn't that of a typical loving mother and son. But she was a second chance. It was a miracle when he agreed. I was more shocked he had convinced his wife to allow it. That awful harlot of a woman never liked me, although I didn't like her either. They refused to speak to me after everything. I haven't heard from them since. They had more grandchildren I'll never meet. I knew at the time my relationships with any of my children were over for good. So when Derek gave me a solution, I took it. I wasn't entirely truthful when we first spoke. I said I hadn't wanted this, but I was desperate. There was never a way to bring her back safely. Derek explained what she would become to me. He was initially trying to put me off, even trying to get her back. I knew exactly what I was getting myself into. But I couldn't pass up the idea of my beautiful little Lila needing her grandma forever. I suppose I was too ashamed to admit it before. But why should I be ashamed? My altercation with Derek happened after she was back, when he tried to kill her the first time. Spouting the same things on that note. What kind of monster wants to kill a little girl? That's why I trashed the garden. He said he wasn't coping with the news of the new block when he suggested it, that he shouldn't have told me that it was even possible and she had to die. I hid her until the bulldozers came in. When he disappeared, I thought I was safe to spend the rest of my life with her. Bernie hated me. Spending time with Lila was all I lived for. I grew to love her how she was. I felt sick. Listening to Prudence talk brought up so many repressed feelings about Jamie. I hadn't had the time to grieve or process anything, and I missed him terribly. My old life and my old future felt a million miles away. I was relieved to know that Derek hadn't tricked Prudence or even intended to create Rat Lila, but he was truly good. But she didn't get to have a life. You lived for her, but she wasn't really living. How could a sane person do that to their own flesh and blood? I retorted. You have no idea. This place can make you do irrational things, but she had a life. She had me. It's all she needed. She was certainly right about the building and the irrational actions. The pain intensifying on my face throbbed in agreement. But I was still convinced that she had lost it Dr. Frankenstein style where Rat Lila was concerned. She had stopped crying. Her rage levels were rising again. I tried to tell her that it wasn't really the child she'd known, but she seemed to have grown an entirely new attachment to the creature that replaced what she had lost. Every rational argument I gave was met with increasing levels of screaming. She got less coherent as she went on. The argument was going nowhere. We went back and forth for what felt like forever. After a while, she started to get closer to me. We had both stood up by this point, and despite her haggard and frail appearance, Prudence was truly frightening. She looked unhinged. Her words were no longer going in. I was overwhelmed and had too many thoughts rushing through my mind to process her ranting. I took a few steps back, clearing a small distance between us. By this point, out of the corner of my eye, I could see the neighbors in the windows of the block. Watching the altercation outside, Prue's screaming had brought a lot of attention. It was bright and I couldn't see well, but I turned to scan the windows and did recognize Eddie and Ellie watching from their bedroom, trying to wave at me. They frantically waved and pointed. I tried waving back and gesturing to them, but they kept pointing at me. Why were they pointing? Then I heard it. The garden shears scraping against the ground as Prudence picked them up and charged towards me. "You ignorant little bitch! You weren't even listening! You don't deserve my home! You killed her!" The twins had been telling me to turn around, but I shouldn't have taken my eyes off of her. Luckily, unlike my earlier shock when I had first seen her, I didn't freeze. My fight or flight instincts kicked in and I ran faster than I ever had before. I burst my back into the building and heard neighbors on the bottom floor lock their doors in a symphony of bolts clicking. I couldn't blame them. Prudence wasn't far behind me and I wouldn't want to take her on in her current state if given a choice. But it didn't stop me pounding on the doors begging someone to call the police, although something told me that in this building that wasn't going to happen. I ran up the stairs, still being followed by her. By the second floor, most were still locked, but a few had come out of their homes, armed with a variety of heavy objects. Even in a crisis, I couldn't fault the community spirit here. I ran another flight of stairs that became 2, but still led me to floor 3, and then back up to the corridor. I pounded on Terry's door. My heart was racing, but when I turned, Prue was nowhere to be seen. I was hoping the people who came out on floor 2 had stopped her, but something was odd. I hadn't heard any commotion. This wasn't the end of it. Eddie and Ellie hugged me as tight as Terry let me in and bolted the door shut quickly behind me. I told her about what had happened. She couldn't believe what Prue had done. It turned out no one knew about Lila. I was edgy for the first hour, but Prue had disappeared. Terry helped clean up my burn and put some cold compress on it. She offered to take me to the hospital, but I couldn't. I was too shaken up for what had just happened. I couldn't face trying to explain how I'd sustained my injuries, and I still hadn't reported Jamie missing. He still hadn't had any messages from his family, and work had given up calling, but his friends had started. They were harassing me nonstop, but I had been too distracted to come up with a decent lie. It had been a week since I moved in, and it wouldn't be long until people realized something was seriously wrong. The conversations with my family had been short, with me insisting they didn't visit until we were, quote, unpacked and set up. On top of a murderous old lady and an untold amount of abnormal issues in the real world, problems were starting to creep up on me. I sat with Terry for hours, drinking tea and chatting to her. It started to get dark and Eddie and Ellie came into the living room after playing in their room for a while. The voids replaced the big brown puppy dog eyes again, and their claws looked especially sharp, but to me, they were still adorable. Their transformation prompted me to head back to my flat. It was late. I needed to work out what to do next and how to dig myself out of this giant hole. I couldn't just keep planting gardens. I needed to do this myself. I wandered up the stairs. They went on for a while, but nothing too horrific. I passed the man on floor 5, nodding politely and continuing my ascent. I wondered if he'd received the letter of concern yet. It was a little unsettling. When I got to my floor, Mr. Prentice was making his animal noises again. I smiled, which hurt my face. After all the madness, I was starting to find the seemingly benign horrors of the building oddly comforting. I reached my flat and turned the key in the door before bolting myself in like Terry had. I could feel something wasn't right the moment I entered. The flat was in chaos, which was nothing new because we had only moved in a week ago and I hadn't been too preoccupied to unpack. But things were out of place. The organized chaos wasn't how I'd left it. Hi, boss. Then she strolled out of my kitchen. Prudence Hemmings. She was carrying a large carving knife in her left hand this time. She had prepared for her attack. She smiled at me and lifted her right hand, jingling a set of keys that she had entered with. I turned to unbolt the door, but she grabbed me from behind before I could turn the handle to open it and held the knife to my throat. I will kill you for what you've done, she whispered into my ear. Without a second thought, I leaned forward just a tad and swung my head back as hard as I could. I couldn't believe that worked, but I must have broken her nose. Prudence dropped the knife and clutched her face, blood streaming between her fingers. I went to grab the knife, but she was closer and doing the same thing. I had no other option but to run again. I grabbed the door handle and I turned it to exit the flat as she tried to stab me. I was mostly out the door, but her arm was close enough to reach my side and I felt the knife pierce the side of my torso. I was in searing pain, but I didn't stop running. As I stepped outside my flat, I could still hear Mr. Prentice's noises flooding the entire hallway. It gave me an idea. I ran towards his door, Prudence stabbing at me frantically with blood gushing from her nose. A few got me as I stopped outside flat 48. The pain was awful and I could feel myself starting to drift out of consciousness. I was losing a lot of blood. I would give my last breath to end Prue, so running on nothing but adrenaline, I knocked hard on flat 48 and shouted, "Mr. Prentice, can you help me?" It was a shot in the dark. I didn't know what would happen, but I had to try something. She stopped stabbing me. At me. She was enjoying watching me bleed out slowly from the wound she had already inflicted. I was incredibly weak, and I lost consciousness not long after that. But before I did, I heard heavy clunking from the inside of flat 48, chain locks being released and bolts being undone. I watched with blurry vision as a large creature that I can only describe as a cross between a bull and a wolf charged out of the flat and trampled the old witch to death. I heard her bones crunch just as I slipped away. I woke up in the hospital a day later. My parents were there, as were the police. Apparently I had been found just outside the tower block with my handbag missing by a neighbor who had been watching from a window as it happened. The police told me that the person had seen the mugging out of their window. They had seen two men approach me and Jamie, splash something in my face, attack us, and when he tried to fight back, they bundled my boyfriend into a car, which the police had been searching for to no avail. He was officially missing. I was baffled, but grateful that Jamie's disappearance wouldn't be blamed on me. I went along with it and made out that he had ghosted work to enjoy our first week living together. I had been stabbed 4 times, but thankfully all in the right places, if there is such a thing as the right place to be stabbed. I lost a lot of blood, but I was going to be fine. They were all shallow. They assumed my burns were chemical and happened during the mugging too. The police promised to keep us updated, but they still can't find the car. They never will. I wish the story the police had told were true. It left some hope for Jamie. My parents weren't keen on me returning to the flat after what happened. They said that the area was too rough and that I was living proof that it wasn't safe. They offered to collect my stuff for me. I insisted though, told them that I wanted to see how I felt, and they couldn't force me not to. I was released from the hospital 2 days after I woke up in there. When I arrived at the flats, it was strange. It felt like home. Despite everything, something about this place drew me to it. I took the lift for the first time since Jamie had died. I had to. I wasn't recovered enough to conquer too many stairs just yet, and I couldn't guarantee that they'd be kind to me. I smiled at the lack of a button 9 and winced at the thought of the creatures. As I reached my corridor, I saw Mr. Prentice walking along with his newspaper and milk in a bag. He turned to me and smiled. I wasn't sure you'd come back. It's nice to see that you're up and walking. He made small talk as if I hadn't seen him literally trample a woman to death a couple of days prior. The whole experience had been so disorienting that I started to wonder if I really had been mugged, and had dreamed of the note and everything that's happened since. Then he said something that confirmed everything was real. I never liked that woman, but you've got a real friend in the lady downstairs. He winked at me and turned the key in his door. I got into mine and sat down on the second-hand sofa. I felt empty but relieved. With Prue and the imposter neighbors all gone, the only threat left were the creatures in the lift, were only a threat between 111 and 333. Maybe I could start to live a semi-peaceful life in this place. Terry knocked on the door, my handbag that I had left at hers before Prue attacked me in my flat, on her arm. Mr. Prentice was right. She was a good friend. I thanked her for what she had done, and for what she had told the police. She said it was pure luck that she found me. She had been walking up to return the bag and found me and Prue sprawled out on the floor. I asked what happened to Prue's body. She just pointed in the direction of flat 48. He was eating it, she said. It's been a few days now, and I've decided to stay. I can't imagine going back to complete normality after everything I've been through, and I've grown quite attached to some of the building quirks. I tried replanting the garden with the help of the twins. I rubbed a few stitches doing it, and Derek never came. I think he's gone for good. I'm ready to fully embrace life here. The last few days have been hard, but there's some time to breathe. Along with the time to breathe came the time to grieve, and I've been grieving badly for Jamie. This leads me to the last thing I have to tell you. Last night, I laid in bed, played with the thoughts of Prue and everything that had happened. But what I couldn't get to leave my mind was how much happiness it brought her to have Lila back. It infected every part of my thoughts. I know you all warned me not to, but I did it. I repeated the ritual. I haven't caught him yet, but I've heard the scratching. Jamie is back. Oh. Thanks. Thanks, Feed Bridger. So, it's chapter number unknown. And we're going to continue reading the rest. The flat isn't new anymore, and I need a better guide. 4 years ago, we've increased the time frame. I think the last chapter that I just read, we had already read it, so this is all new content from here. It's been a long time since I moved into this apartment, picked up that damn note from the tenant before me, and unlocked a world of demon window cleaners and vile rat-like creatures that live in the communal lift. If you don't know me, hi, my name is Kat, and a few months ago I found myself living in a home filled with unusual occurrences. You can start here, hyperlink, if you want to know more. If any of you do remember me, I'm back again, begging for your help. I don't even really know how to begin with this, but I think I owe you all an apology. You warned me, gave me advice, and tried to stop me from making the biggest damn mistake of my life. I didn't listen. Instead, I let my emotional immaturity get the better of me. I really wish I had listened. I'm sorry I ghosted you all. I was embarrassed. I know I disappeared without a word, and for that I am really sorry. I can't blame any of you for comparing me to Prudence. The events following my moving into the block had me in such an emotional place. You have to understand, it was a lot to take in. No one can be truly equipped to live somewhere like this. It was bound to catch up with me eventually. The months since I last updated you have been hellish, and now I found myself in further trouble. It wasn't long after my last post that I caught Jamie. I enticed him into the flat with cat food left out by the door. I ran the risk of being mauled alive by the remaining lift creatures to capture my monstrosity of a boyfriend. He was smaller than I thought. I expected him to be much larger than Lila because of the age difference, but he wasn't. Maybe as big as a large dog? Something I missed about Jamie more than anything was his once huge stature. An odd quality to consider, I know, but he was 6'3", and his cuddles felt like the safest place I'd ever been. Looking at the small, deformed humanoid creature hunched over, crunching on cat biscuits with his sharp, jagged teeth tucked under a grotesque rodent nose made me feel sick. I instantly knew that I'd made a mistake, that the love of my life was gone for good, but that thing had Jamie's eyes. They were unmistakable. Suddenly Prudence's need to keep Lila around made sense. I could see an entire life in those eyes that had been ripped away from me, and I was too selfish to let it go. I suppose in that respect I'm exactly like her. Exactly what you all think. A monster. I fashioned a place to keep him hidden in the large built-in wardrobe of our bedroom. It wasn't like Lila's cage was, cold and restrictive. It had space, lights, and photos of us before everything happened. It was like a walk-in wardrobe. Ironically, it was something that originally attracted me to the flat. The only similarity to Lila's tiny cage was the large padlock that secured it. I tried everything to bring that little piece of Jamie left inside the creature out. I really did. I sat with him for hours, talking about our lives, reminiscing, and trying to feed him his favorite meals. He would make awful raspy noises when I spoke to him at first, grunting and wheezing, as if he were struggling to breathe. I received more than a few bites and scratches, and he refused to eat anything that I gave him, opting for scraps instead. I thought about killing him. A lot. It's a position I never thought I'd be in when we were searching for a home together, and at some point I realized I considered it daily. I've come close to attempting it more than a few times, but every time I look at those damn eyes, I can't. I'm weak. So, I've tried to cope. I've taken the best care of him that I can. I've gotten involved with my neighbors. I babysat Terry's twins twice a week at her place while she slept, and I'm actively involved in the residence committee. I never told anyone what I did, aside from all of you. There's only two people I feel I could admit my mistakes to. One was locked in my wardrobe, while the other was seemingly gone forever. Despite this, I kept the garden immaculate in the hope that one day Derek could return, and it kept me sane. I even managed to revive one of the shrubs that Prudence tried to butcher during her attack, but no matter how much love I gave, it just wouldn't flourish, and the bench remained empty. All this while I kept my deepest shame in my bedroom cupboard. Regardless of all the anguish this place has brought me, there's nowhere else in the world I would consider home anymore. I've never felt more connected to a place in my life. So I've stayed. I've coped, and I've kept busy. The tower block may be special, and its residents may often live in another world, but we weren't completely immune to the outside. Government lockdown hit us recently too. With lockdown came the loss of routine as we knew it. The whole building went into chaos, and I was no exception. Being trapped in the flat with him all day undid months' worth of self-distraction and denial in a matter of hours. I'd never been more aware of what an abhorrent thing I'd done than those first few weeks. The other residents were going through their own crises. Terry hadn't slept in weeks. We FaceTime regularly, and I missed her and the kids terribly. Every time I spoke to her, she looked awful. There was wailing at night, banging at all hours of the day, and a whole building's worth of inhabitants struggling. When they deemed window cleaning non-essential, it sent that particular pest into chaos. He still appeared on the balconies, but instead of the relentless niceties, he just scratched desperately at the window. I tried not to open the curtains I finally got around to buying a few months ago. I couldn't take his pleading eyes. The residence committee tried to put things in place to keep the block going. We were running Zoom meetings, and a number of us started collecting essentials for the elderly and vulnerable residents of our floors. Having socially distanced chats with them from the corridor as we drop off. To be honest, it was much a lifeline for me as the elderly residents. Anything to get out of the flat, away from him. I was allocated 3 residents for my floor, living in flats 48, 51, and 43. Percy and Sylvia live in flat 43. They're next door to me and generally very pleasant. Sylvia has a breathing problem, so they had to isolate. They're older, but very independent. Most of the time, they just needed a few essentials and didn't want to chat. Mr. Prentice from flat 48 was easy too. He'd been an immensely private man since I've known him, and lockdown hadn't changed that. He did seem to make more of the animalistic noises I'd come to know him for, but I think being trapped inside would do that to anyone with his particular afflictions. Since he trampled Prudence, I had been much more tolerant of the sounds anyway. The only thing I really learned about him from doing his shopping is that he loves a drink, and there's often a bottle of whiskey in the bag he carries home with his newspaper inside. Once a week, he'd ask me to drop off an envelope of cash to the pub he drinks in, the Pickled Gnome. He said that the owner is a good friend and he worries about her getting by financially with the pub shut at the moment. It warmed my heart. He's such a lovely man. Flat 51 was different from the other two. I hadn't ever met the occupant, despite having lived here for almost a year now. I'd seen a young man going in and out occasionally, but he never stayed long. The flat was occupied by Miss Esther Beckman, a blind elderly widow. The man visiting her was her son, who had his own profoundly disabled child and couldn't support his mother through the pandemic. The first time I knocked on her door, I was nervous. I wasn't sure why. I just felt uncomfortable trying to help someone I knew nothing about. I knocked and stood back. It took a few moments for Miss Beckman to answer. Esther had wild gray hair. She hadn't cut it like most of her older ladies tend to. She'd allowed it to grow, and it had formed spectacular waves. She was well presented, and I'm embarrassed to say I didn't expect that from a blind person. She wore a satin blue dress gown over the top of a white day dress and had a pair of comfortable-looking slippers on that perfectly matched the color of her dressing gown. "Are you the girl Molly phoned about? I told her I'm fine, but the interfering old bat insisted," she greeted me with, rummaging in the pocket of her dressing gown for a packet of cigarettes. I watched her open the pack and light the last one. Her brash attitude didn't put me off. I like people with a bit of tenacity, and I wasn't particularly fond of the residence committee chairperson Molly Thompson either. I'm Kat, although I'm sure Molly will have referred me as Catherine. Not my name, by the way. Anyway, I'm happy to pick up anything that you need, and I'm here if you just want to chat. I stumbled a little as I spoke. Esther laughed. "See, even interfering in something as personal as your name, I never liked that woman." She paused and took a few drags of her cigarette, hesitating before she continued. "I don't need much. If you could grab me a pack of cigarettes and a microwave meal every day, I'm fine. I don't like to ask, but my son can't come, and without a smoke, I think I'd go... What? And without a smoke, I think I'd go potty?" She took another long drag of her cigarette and reached into her pockets to pull out some change and a 20-pound note. She winced a little as she asked for help. It clearly wasn't something she was used to. "Throw me the packet so I know which brand to get," I answered. Esther threw me the empty carton after shoving her money inside, and I barely caught it. She smoked the same brand I did, so I reached into my pocket and pulled out 3 or 4 individual cigs and tossed them back. They hit the floor. She's blind, I thought, mortified. There's a few cigs in the floor in front of you. Sorry, I didn't think. But they're the same brand as yours. They should keep you going until I get back." As I said, she smiled properly for the first time. "Oh, you're all right, aren't you?" "Thanks. Before you go, just a bit of advice for you. Take the route through the park instead of the round," she answered. I thought it was strange, but everything in the tower was. I told her that I would, and said my goodbyes. The stairs that constantly skipped weren't too kind to me that trip. The 7 flights became 18, and by the time I reached the bottom, my thighs were burning. I exited the building and thought about Esther's suggestion. The route around the park. was quicker, but I decided a pleasant wander through the trees would only keep me away from Jamie for longer, so without any further hesitation, I took her advice. My legs were sore from the stairs, but it was a beautiful day. About halfway through the park, I heard a loud crash and the screeching of car tires followed by screaming. I sped up, and when I finally reached the exit, I turned the corner towards the shop at the source of the noise. It was utter carnage. A car had slammed into the motorbike at the zebra crossing. Oh, crosswalk. And caused a devastating accident. Crowds gathered with multiple people on the phone to emergency services. I was shaken entering the shop. I couldn't stop thinking about the poor people involved in the crash. Esther's words echoed in my mind as I thought about the fact that I had taken the usual route I would have probably been crossing at the crash site as it happened. The realization that Miss Beckman's suggestion had saved my life sent my mind into overdrive. I know that many of you think I learned nothing from my experiences moving into the block, but I did learn that there are no coincidences here. She had known exactly what was going to happen. I left the shop and chose to go back through the park. I was leaving nothing to chance, but it frustrated me that I couldn't get back home quicker. When I reached the building, I flung the main door open and started to climb the stairs. They must have sensed my urgency because they only made me climb 4 flights this time. I stared at the numbers on the flat door. 51. Why had I never met her before? Why had she been hiding in her flat? I placed the shopping bag close to the door, rapped hard on it with my knuckles, and shouted, "Miss Beckman!" A few moments passed. I knocked again. Give me a chance to open the door, Captain, please. It's Essie, or would you prefer I called you Catherine? She opened the door and replied, scoffing, as she said Catherine. How did you know? I demanded. Know what? You know what? You saved my life. The crash. Oh, I didn't save your life. I knew that if you had walked around the park, you'd be in trouble. I had no idea that there'd be a crash. I just made a suggestion. You saved your own life when you took it, she said flippantly. So, can you see the future? I asked, desperate for answers. Oh, don't you dare. Blind woman, second sight. My whole life, the residents of this block have tried to reduce me to a walking cliche, and I'm not doing it anymore. I don't see anything. I've been blind since birth. I've just always had a particularly accurate instinct. She spoke with a passion. I can see why she locked herself away. If the other residents knew about her talents, I'm sure she was hounded. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to offend you. I haven't been here long. These things still surprise me. Thank you for sharing your instinct. I would have been squished if you didn't. Well, I'm glad you weren't. She reached down and picked up the shopping bag, taking out the packet of cigarettes to open and light one. Thanks for this, she said, rustling the bag with her fingers. What flat do you live in? Number 42, I answered. Essie beamed. Ha! I overheard someone saying that the old witch was dead, but I wasn't sure I believed them. I thought Prudence Hemmings would ride out a nuclear apocalypse like the cockroach she was. I cringed at the sound of her name. I tried to not think about it too much, or what she put me through. I tried to focus on what I love about the block. Essie would tell me she struck a nerve. Did I hit a sore point? She continued, noting my discomfort. Well, I wasn't a fan of Prudence either. The idea of her coming back with the cockroach antenna in the night will keep me awake now, I answered, trying to lighten the mood. You're funny. If antenna would have benefited that woman, she'd have done anything to grow them. It's nice to have some young blood in this place. It was all starting to get a bit too old and stale. Take care, Cat. We said our goodbyes and she closed the door. That night I thought about Essie. I imagined introducing her to the twins. I was sure she would love them, and thought of trying to get her involved with the block again when all this was over. It made me smile. Unfortunately, my happy thoughts were soon to be interrupted by Jamie. I sat on my bed with a cup of tea and I could hear him from the cupboard, scratching and wheezing. I went and opened it up to stroke him a few times. Saliva dripped from his sharp teeth down his deformed jaw. It disgusted me. I shut my eyes and tried to imagine my once gorgeous boyfriend, arms around me on the mattress on the floor of the flat for the one night that we got to spend here together. I wished every day that I could go back to that, but it would never happen. When I opened my eyes, there he was, that monster. I got close to Essie over the first few weeks. I got her cigarettes and a microwave meal every day, and we chatted at the door. After a few days, I was taking my morning cup of tea to sit in the corridor and talk to her. I started making enough food for two so that she could have something home cooked. She hated my lasagna, but she was grateful. She had lost her husband young, not long after she had her son and never dated again. Her life was fascinating. She spent years as a social worker before she retired. She said that her people instinct helped her give great advice to her clients, and she'd managed to help a lot of people out of bad situations. Essie may have been older, but she was full of life. I asked her why I never saw her, why she never came to the committee meetings or got involved. As I suspected, she'd grown sick of the whole block hounding her for her predictions about their lives. She told me that once Molly had begged her to tell her the gender of her unborn grandchild before the child's mother had found out so that she could hold it over her. What a bitch. It sounded like it got intense. People were offering to pay for the winning lottery numbers or the bank details of Bill Gates. They didn't want to listen when she tried to tell them that it wasn't how it worked. So she kept a distance, saw her son, and that was about it. It made me sad. I vowed that even after this lockdown was over, I was going to keep spending time with Essie. I didn't want to think of anyone hauled up in home all the time without anyone to talk to. I told Terry about her, and she remembered Essie being friends with her parents while she was growing up. Terry told me she had been a resident for forever. I dropped Essie's shopping at the door and sat down in the corridor to chat as usual one afternoon. We spoke about music and her love of jazz. It was pleasant. Just before I left, she stopped me and told me that she had an instinct that she needed to tell me about. It was unusual. She didn't like to share them, and I didn't like to pester, but she insisted it was important. Kat, one of your friends, needs help. You need to know that it is possible. It won't be easy, but if you look hard enough, you will find a way. That was all she said. She claimed it was all she knew, but I think Essie liked to hold things back sometimes. Either way, it was cryptic and confusing. I lamented her for it. That's all you're giving me? What am I supposed to do with that? I quizzed her. Haven't got a fucking clue, she replied, lighting yet another cigarette. I got an instinct and I told you. What more do you want? There's others in this block that would kill for one of Essie Beckman's famous instincts. She laughed and flipped her wild hair mockingly. I sat in the corridor outside of hers for a while, even after she closed the door. I thought about what her instinct could mean. When I finally gathered up the stomach to enter my flat, I thought of Jamie. What if it meant could help him? What if what I'd done was reversible? What if there was hope? Or maybe it meant killing him really was the only way I could help him, and if I looked at myself hard enough, I'd finally find the strength to follow through. I struggled to sleep that night, despite trying to go to bed early. Every scratch, wheeze, and gasp from the cupboard sent me bolt upright, and it took until just after 1 a.m. before I finally drifted off. When I woke in the morning, I had 5 missed calls from Terry, 2 from 3 a.m., and 3 from that morning. My heart dropped. The kids. I knew Ellie had been going through a stage of trying to get out of the flat, and I was terrified something had happened to her. I could barely hold the phone as I dialed back. Thankfully, she answered quickly. Terry? Are you okay? What happened? Are the kids okay? I practically screamed at her down the microphone. Kat, I'm fine. We're fine. But I have to tell you something. Terry was serious. She was never serious. What is it? Last night, Ellie got out. She made it all the way up to your floor to try and visit you, but by the time I caught up with her, as I was about to march her downstairs, I spotted something. It's Miss Beckman, Kat. She was walking into the lift. Her words cut into my soul. I let out a gentle sob. I'm sorry, Kat. I tried to stop her. I screamed at her name, but she didn't turn. She just walked in. I couldn't do anymore. I had Ellie there, and when I checked the time, it was 2:15. I'm so sorry. And that's where this predicament begins, in an ironically similar place to before, with me mourning the loss of a loved one to the lift. And that was the end of that chapter. Let's see. Let's see. How many more do we have in this one? 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9? 9 more chapters? This author is very dedicated to the story, and I'm very glad for it. I will say that. I'm very glad for it. I'm glad you guys are enjoying the sleepy times. Ah. Next part. When one door closes, another opens. The death of Miss Esther Beckman hit me hard. She wouldn't have lambasted me for writing her name that way, but I feel like it's important that people remember it in its entirety. Essie was special. She deserves that much. I didn't get to spend long with her, but I was grateful that I'd met her at all. The committee's initiative to shop for vulnerable residents during lockdown had been devised to benefit those residents, but I believe that I had needed Essie more than she ever needed me. She'd become my lifeline in that short time, the only distraction from my atrocious misjudgments, and she was gone. When I got off the phone from Terry, I lit up a cigarette for Essie. I quietly sobbed at the foot of my table, at my fold-up table, into my cup of tea. I couldn't understand why she would do what she did. Walking into the lift between 111 and 333 as the creatures who inhabited it were at the height of their frenzy was an unmistakable suicide. I felt the pang of loss. It, in turn, ignited an emotional muscle memory, and I was put back into the place I had been all those months ago. I felt every emotion I had felt when I stepped into the lift and repeated the ritual. When I sentenced Jamie to a life spent as one of those things. Essie was the first to perish in the lift since the creatures ripped Jamie apart on the night we moved in. The whole block are aware of the dangers, which ironically made the risk pretty low. Prince Hemming's negligence had led to my tragedy, but there was nothing to explain what had happened to my new friend. I had only known her for a short time, but she really was full of life. She spoke about missing her son and grandson, and how she would get to have a cup of tea together that I didn't have to drink in the corridor one day. She had plans. I didn't believe that she wanted to die. Her last words of advice to me rang through my mind. One of your friends needs help. You need to know that it is possible. What if she had been talking about herself and she just hadn't realized? I wondered if I'd already failed her. Maybe this wasn't about Jamie at all. Ideas snowballed in my mind for what felt like hours, sat at that table. My thoughts were eventually interrupted by a knock on the door. It was Terry and the kids. I opened, and they stood back a safe distance. I'm sorry, Kat. I know you probably want to be alone, but the kids knew you'd be sad about Miss Beckman, and they wanted to come and see you. I've already dropped some bits off to Mr. Prentice and the couple next door, so you don't have to worry today. Terry was sweet. She had been nothing but nice to me right from the start, and I loved those kids like my own flesh and blood. She was wrong about me wanting to be alone. Just seeing the twins' faces lifted my spirits. Here's an ear hug, Cat. Eddie made a cuddling motion with his arms, gripping the thin air of the corridor. It was adorable. One of the hairless cats that walked the halls played at his feet, being careful not to brush against him so as to not burn his young skin. Air hugs back, I answered. I miss you guys. We miss you too. Mom says she can't wait until you can babysit us again. Don't be sad, Ellie added, melting my heart a little. They were growing into such kind and amazing people. You would struggle to believe that they looked like demons all night long and never slept. I could see that Terry was struggling. She had huge dark circles under her eyes, and she had yawned multiple times in a short interaction. I felt for her. As much as I love those kids, and the lack of sleep when I do sit for them is killer. I couldn't imagine having gone as long as we had, been locked down, existing on stolen hours here and there like Terry does. I can't wait either. We're going to have so much fun. I couldn't finish my sentence. My attention was grabbed by an almighty scraping sound coming inside my flat. Are you okay? Terry started, noticing my sudden silence and change of expression. I'm fine, I answered bluntly. I wasn't. The noise became more frantic in the background. What's that noise, Cat? Eddie asked with a childlike innocence. I didn't want to lie to him, but I had no intention of telling the truth. There was a reason I only babysat in Terry's flat. I couldn't bear for the kids to be at risk or think of me as a monster. The scraping and the scratching slowly started to become bangs and crashes. I have to go. Thank you for coming to see me. You've made my day, guys. You have no idea. I'll see you soon, I promise. With that, I shut the door and bolted the latch. I felt awful. I never wanted to be so rude, but they had treated me as their family. But after dragging them through so much when we first met, I didn't want to subject them to him. I didn't deserve to suffer my mistakes. I ran to the padlocked wardrobe and froze, staring at it for a few minutes. I watched as the central line where the two doors had met expanded and contracted with every pound from inside, as if the doors were breathing. He had started to wheeze and grunt uncontrollably. In all these months, I hadn't seen behavior like it. I was genuinely fearful that if I opened the door, he would rip me apart limb from limb. How the fuck did my life come to that? Hiding from my undead semi-rodent boyfriend. I sat down in front of the breathing doors with my back to them in an attempt to keep him in and cried. I felt like that's all I'd done. Cried. The fighting spirit had been knocked out of me. I'd been reduced to a sniveling mess. The pounding on the door didn't stop. As the time passed, he didn't calm down. He just became more desperate, frenzied. I wondered if this was how the ones in the lift had behaved before they tore him to pieces. Or as Essie waltzed into their territory. Maybe he was only behaving this way because the others had finally gotten a victim. My phone went multiple times. It was Terry. I threw the still ringing phone across the floor and held my head in my hands. It became a pattern. The pounding against my back, the phone ringing, all the noises around me started to become formulaic and repetitive. I wanted it to stop so bad. I don't need this right now, Jamie, I begged, frustrated. I didn't expect a reply. I had spoken to him often, trying with everything I could think of to dig out the man I knew, with increasing futility. Regardless, I found it therapeutic to talk. Not once had I gotten a reply. Until then, Cat. Cat. He rasped in something that I can't really describe as a proper voice. The pounding had stopped, only the raspy breaths and sound of saliva dripping from his mouth remained. Cat. He wheezed finally, as if in pain. The tears stopped. I jumped up immediately and fumbled with the key to the padlock to open the prison. As it opened, he stared at me, Jamie's eyes looking sad and desperate. I stared back, wiping the tears from my face. For a brief interlude, I wasn't the creature looking back at me. It really was Jamie. It hurt. For just a moment, I was truly alone with my soulmate, but it didn't last. It couldn't. His eyes turned from the familiar blue tone to black. It made him look more rodent-like. The lack of a distinguishable iris made them beady, just like a rat. I stood still, watching uncomfortably as he stood on his hind legs, stretching out from his usual hunched positioning. I noted the sharp teeth tucked underneath his deformed and fleshy nose. It was one of the few patches with no fur. In the blink of an eye, he launched himself forward, clawing at my face. I was taken off guard and flew backwards as he made contact. He hesitated on top of me, my face inches from his grotesque snout for a moment, baring his teeth with the lust in his black eyes, spittle dripping onto my face from the tips of his sharpened fangs. He didn't seem so small anymore. It gave me just enough time to roll the fire poker I kept up against the wardrobe towards me. Weaponizing the entire flat was a rule of prudence's that, unlike others, had actually proved useful. I gripped it with my right hand as I felt his claws start to penetrate my chest, sending a searing pain through my body. I plunged the poker into the side of Rat Jamie's neck, watching his deep crimson blood splattered across the room and the doors of the wardrobe. I started to hyperventilate. He rolled off me in a heavy slump. Had I killed him? I thought. Was my nightmare finally over? I agonized over the fact that I hadn't had the bottle to put him out of his misery, but had been able to follow through when he attacked me. I felt like such a selfish person. Despite this, I was relieved, looking at the blood and the unmoving fur heap on the floor next to me. My hand shook violently, alerting me that I was still holding the poker. I dropped it instantly with a loud clank and took a moment to breathe. My relief was short-lived. The furry, patchy heap on the floor started to slowly rise and sink rhythmically. He was breathing. The blood stopped pouring from the wound, and he lethargically raised a clawed hand to wipe at the area like an animal would. I took no chances and dragged him back into the cupboard before his strength rebuilt. I know what you're all thinking, and I assure you, it crossed my mind too. Just keep going, keep stabbing until he doesn't wake up. It's a reasonable thought process. I wish it were that simple, but nothing in this building is. If he got up from the attack, stabbing wasn't the answer. He should have been dead. 3 times over with the amount of blood loss? Even if I wanted him dead, at this stage I had no idea how. Fucked me up, trying to make connections between his sudden ability to communicate, the attack, and Essie's prediction. I didn't even know where to start. I placed a bowl of cat food next to the weary creature locked in the cupboard and placed the second unnecessary chair for my fold-out table against the center of the 2 doors. I was at a total loss and things were spiraling out of control. I sat on the now singular chair in my living room and smoked. I smoked and I drank tea. I think it must be some kind of ingrained British coping mechanism I've adopted because while it didn't cure my anxiety, it did calm me down. I texted Terry to tell her everything was fine. I tried to type out the truth multiple times, but I deleted every single attempt. I didn't know how to tell her that I'd lied to her all this time, so I carried on lying. She'd always told me she'd be there for me if we needed to talk. I know she meant it. She was the most loyal friend I've ever had, which is why disappointing her was even more terrifying. After a few hours, the screaming started. The inhuman, earth-shattering screaming, with intervals of low growls. Jamie had come to. The noises rivaled Mr. Prentice's, and I wondered if the neighbors would be concerned. But in a block like mine, late at night screaming and growling is the norm. Jamie could be eating me alive, and no one might think to check. Even if they did, there's not much they could do to help. I visualized Percy and Sylvia turning up their television to drown out my screams. It wasn't screams of pain. It was anger, a battle cry. The attack he subjected me to was just a warning. I could feel the disdain coming through the thin wooden barrier separating us. If his behavior continued, I was going to be dead for sure. About 11 p.m. I couldn't take it anymore, and I decided I was going to take my government-approved exercise and get the fuck out of my four walls. The halls were alive. The more peaceful of our not-so-average residents had utilized the quiet time to enjoy their home. The cats frolicked, wrestling and chasing each other up and down the stairs. I wondered if they had skipped for them too, and if they ever escaped each other by ending up on different floors. As I descended, the man on floor 5 was as stoic as ever. I smiled. He had become somewhat of a favorite of mine. Passing him on the stairs always meant that home was nearby. "Hi, Clive," I waved at him as I passed. I gave him a different name every time, in the hope that one day I would get it right. He didn't respond. Didn't even look. But then again, he never did. I added Clive to my catalog of not names. The boy who lived in the mirror that runs adjacent to the stairs waved. That's new. His hair was tousled and messy, and he wore a stained green striped t-shirt. He pulled faces and blew raspberries frantically at me in my reflection. I blew them back, pushing up the center of my nose to resemble a pig, which was met with silent, roaring laughter. The stairs were poorly lit at night, but I still managed to count every landing I reached. 9 flights this time. Not bad, I thought. Grateful it wasn't any worse. When I reached the bottom, I felt a release, like everything bad about my life was locked away in that flat, and I was free. It was chilly outside. I had worn a thin cardigan, but I could still feel it in the air. I made a beeline for the bench up by the postage stamp of a garden next to the block. It was strange to see a city so empty. Usually outside the tower was brimming with activity, but the threat of the virus had left it desolate. As I sat in the cool air, I tried to clear my mind. A good friend once told me that being in nature helps our brains to release serotonin, and it's true. The soil will literally make you happier. I tried to embrace the serenity of the nature, but I was soon infiltrated by a series of tiny mewing sounds coming from the foliage I had planted against the outer wall of the block. I fumbled in my pockets for a phone and played around with it until the torch turned on. I approached the greenery with caution, not wanting to spook a cat if it was injured in there. The fallen bits of foliage crunched underneath my feet as I got closer to the small shrub, but the mewing didn't stop. After a gentle search, I realized that the sound was coming from 3 tiny kittens. They were so small, with wrinkled, furless skin. They weren't newborn. Their eyes were open, and they were relatively alert. They were for certain offspring of the cats that had wandered the halls. I was baffled. I had no idea they could reproduce. As the largest of the 3 rubbed its head against my hand, I felt my fingers singe a little. I sat with the kittens for ages. I took the opportunity to sit in my lap pretty quickly, and I waited for their mother to return. I grew increasingly worried, and the 3 little naked kittens seemed to get cold. I sat them down on the bench wrapped in my cardigan, and started to call for the mother, shivering myself. About 20 minutes passed and nothing appeared. I wrapped the bundle up in a little snugglier for extra warmth and started to search through the bushes. They were part of a planted bed that stretched a third of the length of the tower block. I kept an eye on the bench and moved further along the foliage. I looked hard until eventually I found something. A fair-sized ventilation grate was hidden behind one of the shrubs. I hadn't remembered it being there when I planted it. Looking through the metal bars was a vine of some sorts that seemed to be growing upwards through it from the inside, making it impossible to see. The grate led to what must have been a basement. A basement that the block didn't have. I squinted hard, trying to make out the inside of the room, but I couldn't see a thing. After a few seconds, I noticed that the vine was visibly growing around my feet, twisting over my shoes. It freaked me out. I dropped my phone and started to wiggle my feet free when I heard an almighty owl coming from inside the grate. It was the kind you heard when cats were fighting outside your window. Oh, yowl, sorry. I fell backwards and was tripped by the vine but broke the piece that was holding on to me as I kicked at it. The shrub had moved aside, covered up the grate again, and the yowling stopped suddenly. I ripped the piece of vine off my foot and grabbed my phone with the other hand. The torch was still beaming into the night sky. I tried to dig back through the bushes, but the grate was gone, and so was the rest of the vine. I put the piece that had snapped off in my pocket and returned to the bench. The yowling gave me a bad feeling about the kitten's mother, so I scooped them up and carried them back inside with me. They gently mewed the entire way. I was frozen and covered in goosebumps, but it was approaching the time that the lift became dangerous, and I wanted to make sure the kittens were okay. So I didn't investigate the downstairs when I entered. I rushed up the stairs. Only 5 flights this time, and unlocked the door to my flat. The screaming had stopped, and had been replaced by loud, raspy snoring. Jamie had finally tired himself out. I set the kittens in a heap on the sofa and found a few cushions and a blanket for them to curl up on. I would go and get food first thing in the morning. They were adorable, cuddled in a tiny heap. I sat at the fold-out table and stared at the piece of vine. It wasn't growing anymore, but it was healthy. I wondered how it survived in a basement and how it had been able to grow at such an exponential rate. How had I lived somewhere for almost a year and not realized it had a basement? I placed the vine in a cup of water and started to stress about my inability to find the grate a second time. My walk to clear my head had just brought up more questions. I couldn't make sense of any of it. Essie's death, Jamie's sudden behavior change, the kittens, the basement, that vine. I had no idea what any of it meant, but I knew I had to find out. I didn't want to sleep anywhere near Jamie, so I curled up on the sofa next to the kittens and put Netflix on in the background. I drifted off to the thoughts of the secret basement and what the fuck might be down there. And that was the end of that chapter. Can you ever really know someone? I woke up in the morning after my discovery of the kittens, with them crawling all over me. I guess that they were a little younger than 8 weeks old. They were strong and independent, pouncing on my chest with their sizzling paws to wake me up. They were well looked after. It made it harder to believe that their mother had just abandoned them. I thought I knew the block. My entrance had been dramatic enough to introduce me to what I thought were the majority of strange goings-on in the place. I walked the halls with a naive confidence that the building wouldn't be able to surprise me anymore. I thought I was prepared for anything. The events of the night before had squashed that confidence. I knew that the building had sealed off floor 9 after the fire, but never considered the possibility of any other hidden floors or flats. Every other floor from the ground up was accounted for, and there were no stairs leading downwards. I hadn't set foot inside the lift since Derek had taken me in there, and I couldn't remember an LG or a -1 button from what we had had. I'd never known the cats to reproduce either. By rights, they're all strays, and if they had been working the place... If they had been working, the place would be overrun with kittens. The cute little bundles on my sofa shouldn't have existed. Jamie was growling still, making low and disturbing noises. Luckily, the screaming had stopped. I nervously unlocked the wardrobe and placed a bowl of cat food in there as quickly as I could before locking it again. The wounds in my chest throbbed as I looked at him and let go of the bowl. Jamie had scratched and bitten a handful of times, but usually by mistake. He had never hurt me badly. It's only made doing something about him much harder. His attack the day before had been different though, intentional. and as I dropped his food in the morning, he bit hard at my finger, drawing blood. I sighed with relief as I secured the padlock and shuddered as I listened to him slurp and crunch on his food. I noticed the bloodstains from his attacks battered up the wardrobe door and shoved the spare chair back over the gap to make sure the door was shut and kept the kitten safe. Walking back to the kitchen to make tea, I noticed the vine of the cup of water on my fold-out table. It had grown. Way more than any plant should have in a matter of hours. It had stretched out of the cup and down the table, producing large, healthy-looking leaves. I had no idea what it meant, if it meant anything at all. If it had come up from a room with no sunlight, then, like the kittens, it shouldn't have existed. Miss Esther Beckman's words echoed in my mind. If you look hard enough, you will find a way. Maybe the friend I had been supposed to help was the kitten's mother. What if she was stuck in the basement and I just needed to find a way in? I didn't have time to think too deeply about it. Terry had run my errands the day before, but I couldn't expect her to do it daily. Percy and Sylvia wouldn't need anything until the weekend. Mr. Prentice would struggle without my help. I had to carry on. So I got dressed, placed a bowl of water down for the kittens, promised them I'd bring back proper food, and made my way down the hall to flat 48. I knocked and stood back to give him time to answer. Morning, Mr. Prentice. I tried my best to smile and be trippy, putting the whirlwind of thoughts I had to the back of my mind. Morning, Cat. I'm sorry to hear about Essie. Terry told me yesterday. She was one of the longest serving residents here, you know, along with myself and Molly. A terrible loss. He hung his head as he gripped his walking stick. She was a great person. I'm sorry I didn't get to know her for longer, I answered, feeling the fake smile that I'd plastered across my face collapse. She helped me out of a few scrapes. Essie had an extraordinary gift. Never once gave bad advice that I know of. She was a great drinking buddy too, back in the day. Mr. Prentice chuckled at his memories, but looked truly saddened by the situation. It was the most I'd ever heard him speak in one go, and his mention of how long they've lived here made me think. Mr. Prentice, do you know if this place has a basement? I asked. He pondered my question for a while. Well, I've never seen one, but that's not to say it doesn't exist. He smiled a little, and I could see he had noticed the despair in my eyes, and his smile was comforting. I struggled to find the words to respond, so he changed the subject. Could you drop some money to my friend at the pub today, please? And grab me a newspaper and a bottle of whiskey, if you don't mind. He threw 2 envelopes of cash onto the corridor floor between us, and I nodded, told him I'd be back soon, and set off. As I exited the main doors, I turned to look at the garden and considered searching for the grate again, then and there, but decided I would wait. It was torturous. Instead, I thought of Essie as I made my way through the park, taking in the breeze and the birdsong. The Pickled Gnome, Mr. Prentice's drinking spot, looked sad and empty. A sign in the window stating closed due to the virus. I popped the envelope labeled Carmilla through a letterbox in the large red door and began to walk away, noticing through the window a lone woman sat at the bar in a dressing gown nursing a cup of tea. As I carried on towards the shop, I heard a voice behind me. Hey! I turned to see the woman standing at the door of the pub, waving her arms. A large, fluffy cat rubbed himself up against her feet. I turned and waved back. Please tell him I said thanks. I really appreciate it. Drinks on me when this is over. You should come too, she shouted, beaming at me. I'll tell him. Stay safe. I shouted back as she ushered the cat back in and closed the door again. Maybe I would have a drink with Mr. Prentice when this was all over. I imagined him with a shot of whiskey telling stories at the block and smiled. It was a nice thought. I ventured further than the usual shop, to one I knew would sell specialized kitten food. I grabbed the whiskey, paper, and a ready meal. Although he never asked, Mr. Prentice never turned down food, and I hated to think of him hungry. When I reached the block again, I struggled to pass the garden a second time, but made my way up the stairs towards the flat, passing the man on floor 5. Hi, Jeremiah, I waved at him. No response. Better take that one off the list. I passed the woman from the gnome's message and the items onto Mr. Prentice and rushed to home to feed the kittens. As I placed the 3 tiny bowls I purchased down, I decided I should name them. I couldn't keep calling them kittens. They became Wrinkles, Tetley, and Mr. Meow, and they were about the only reason I could think of to smile. As they happily lapped up their food, I could hear Jamie growling in the background, scratching at the door. He must have smelled the kitten meat. I waited until they finished every last bite and washed up the bowls immediately to reduce any risk of him trying to pound his way out of the cupboard. Then I left the flat to finally search for the basement. I tried the bottom of the stairs, searched the entire lower floor for a new stairwell or a door, but there was nothing. I tried the garden too, the same spot from the night before, and the bushes was just plain concrete. No grate to be seen, and no vine growing upwards to match the monster in my kitchen. There was no grate the entire perimeter of the building. My heart sunk with a difficult realization. There was only one place that I hadn't looked. Standing in front of the lift was daunting. I imagined Essie and how it was the last thing she had looked at. I wondered if I'd ever know her motives. I imagined Jamie before any of this, walking in, obviously on his way to another shift at work, smiling stupidly at the novelty of us having our own home. My body shook and my legs became weak, but I managed to force them forward and step inside. Staring at the buttons inside the lift took me back to standing with Derek. How safe I had felt compared to now. Having him around felt like having my own private guardian angel, guiding me every step of the way. His absence left a painful void. It made that tiny metal box feel enormous. I once again searched for the button 9, but couldn't find it, despite nothing looking out of place. It was oddly comforting. Expected. Unlike the past few days had been. The lowest floor I could find was G, the one I was currently standing on, but I knew the lift was able to play tricks. I could never be truly sure, not without Derek. I stared at it for what must have been at least 5 minutes, looking as hard as I could, just like Essie had advised, but it turned up nothing. I was grateful to get out of the lift, but frustrated that I hadn't made anything clearer. I stared at it for a while. Its rickety construction and dilapidated feel made my heart pound. I couldn't look at it without imagining blood and bones lining the floor. Fuck you, Essie, I cursed underneath my breath as I walked the stairs toward my flat, defeated. Why did you have to go? Her cryptic intuition had done nothing but raise questions, and she wasn't there to answer any of them. My life was starting to feel like some sort of cruel joke. The stairwell devoid of average human life was eerie and just added to my sense of solitude. I conquered a huge trauma to even stand in that lift, yet all of my searching efforts had taught me that the man on floor 5 wasn't called Eric or Mikey. I reached the flat and paced around it for a while, being careful not to step on Wrinkles, the largest of my 3 adoptees, who seemed to really enjoy playing around my feet. Mr. Prentice was right. Just because I hadn't been somewhere and couldn't see it didn't mean that it didn't exist. I'd taken the building for granted and gotten too comfortable. Derek had once described the place as a living organism, and now I truly felt that was taunting me and mocking my ill-placed confidence. I had to admit to myself that really, in all honesty, I knew nothing about it. Jamie's growls had become like a background symphony to my life. I'm ashamed to say I was able to almost entirely block them out. I couldn't ignore the vine though. It had wrapped itself around the table leg and stretched most of the kitchen floor, going towards the balcony and desperately stretching for the light. I wasn't sure what to do with it. If I returned it to the garden, I might never see the grate again. The vine was the only proof to myself that I had that, it had been there in the first place. I tried to trim part of it off to take to the garden and compare with the other plants there, knowing that it would be an entirely futile endeavor, but as I clamped down with the scissors, they snapped in my hand. The vine was rock solid. It was much tougher than it had been when I tried to pull my foot free. Perhaps the sunlight had done something to it. I tried my best to bunch it up into one corner, but soon gave up, slightly terrified that it might suffocate me in my sleep. Tetley was asleep on the sofa, while the other two played gently with each other. I sat down and tickled them a little, feeling my fingers start to go numb from the heat. I tried to think of other solutions to my problems that continually searching the concrete wall. I knew that it wasn't going to turn up a basement, or tell me why Essie walked into the lift, or help me kill or cure Jamie. Unfortunately, I'm from a generation that solution to every issue is Google, so that's all I could come up with, and I loaded up my laptop. I tried to search for original plans of the block to see if there was any kind of floor plan or architect drawings that could confirm the presence of a basement, but it turned out that the place is too old for those to be online. The block was built in 1951, at the very start of the new high-rise trend. There's limited information on the place other than a few archived articles from around the time it was built and opened. I cursed the libraries having to be shut in this pandemic. According to the articles, it was a turbulent project from start to finish, and was overseen by an architect and property development Mongol who designed and paid for the building himself. There were reports that he was notoriously difficult to work with, and that 3 construction firms pulled out of the project. The next headline I came across intrigued me. Cursed project finally completed, owner found hanged in unoccupied high-rise flats. There was little information on the suicide other than that it had happened. If the building had been how it is today, I can imagine that being alone in the place with no information or even confirmation that what you were seeing was real could drive anyone mad. None of the articles even had the name of the architect, leaving me at a dead end. It took a few searches and more obscure archive city history blogs that I knew existed before I found anything else that piqued my interest. Heir to tragic high-rise architect's fortune suspected of killing his own son. The article was too blurred to read. It was a poorly taken photograph of a newspaper from the late 50s. This took away my chance yet again to find a name for the architect, or even the son. I thought about what bad luck the family had suffered. To be able to design and build something like that in the days meant you must have incredible wealth. But no amount of money could save them from tragedy, especially not from somewhere like here. I tried to adapt my search, instead entering a rabbit hole of murders in the late 50s. As I scanned the page, I damned human nature. There were so many acts of evil detailed in the blogs. I even learned about Ruth Ellis, the last woman to be executed in the UK in 1955. Eventually, I found an entity that matched up. His name was Albert Miles, and he was the eldest of 2 brothers. When his revered architect father died, he took over the management of the tower block that him and his brother had become the very first occupants of. He was hugely successful and pegged to be one of the biggest names in property development in the UK. The once empty block was mostly full by the time of the killings happened. Police were called by a resident living directly below Albert Miles, who complained that the blood was dripping onto their balcony from above. When police arrived, Albert was nowhere to be found, but the body of his 19-year-old son was starting to decompose in the sun on his balcony. He had been stabbed multiple times. Albert was never found or convicted, and the case remained unsolved. However, most were in agreement that he had did it. The bloody kitchen knife belonged to Albert, dropped just inside the doors of the balcony, all but confirmed it. It was interesting, but I wasn't sure it was helpful. I started to worry that my research had gone in completely the wrong direction. I wasn't sure how Albert Miles or the death of his son could help me, and I was about ready to shut my laptop and give up. Then I felt something slither across my shoulder from behind. The vine had grown exponentially, weaving a route from the kitchen to the sofa. I started to panic as it touched my skin, but it didn't wrap itself around me or try to cause any harm. Just gently glided across my shoulder into the computer. It stroked the name of the blog on the header of the page a few times before falling to the ground, only a slight overhang left on the sofa. It didn't want me to stop. There was no more information on Google, so I sent a direct email to the blog owner asking for anything on the Albert Miles killing that they had, or details of anyone they could direct me to. I claimed it was for a university project. I stopped and watched the TV for a while, the kittens all cuddled on my lap. I was grateful for my blanket, creating just enough barrier to stop me melting. Raspy, wheezing snores came from the bedroom. I decided to spend another night on the sofa. It felt much safer. I started to drift off a little and went to shut the laptop, but a loud ping from my email box woke me. Chills ran up my spine a little as I opened the message. Hey Kat, thanks for your email. Unfortunately, that particular case is very little known and doesn't have a lot of information out there at all. As you can appreciate, cold cases can be difficult to catalog, but I aim to provide the most comprehensive online case files possible. The only thing I have on this case that isn't on the blog is a photograph of Albert Miles and his unnamed brother outside the high-rise flats. I was new to blogging at the time I wrote that entry and wasn't sure how to insert images. Your message has reminded me to go back and include this one. I've attached it here in case if it's any use to you. I would recommend checking out similar case files that may fit your project. Please don't hesitate to get in touch if you have any queries. Thank you for reading. Simon, Murders in the Capital. I felt frustration bubbling up. No further information. Another dead end. I'm going to take a quick pause here because I need to go pee. So I'll be right back. So sorry. Sorry. We return. Let's see. Another dead end. I opened up the attachment to take a look at the mysterious Albert Miles. I was resigned that it would be of no use at all. And then the picture loaded. Two men, handsome and maybe in their mid-30s, standing outside the main doors of the largely unchanged block. They were similar looking, with a strong family resemblance, but very different demeanors. One was dressed in a sharp-looking suit and stood with a controlled posture. He had a serious facial expression and pointy features. The other was slumped against the wall, a smile on his face and familiar, kind-looking eyes. This man wore a casual outfit that you might expect to see on a laborer of that era. On top of his head was the clue that I had been looking for in the form of a flat cap. There, standing next to Albert Miles, was my lost friend Derek. We continue. Some families are more dysfunctional than others. We have a small trigger warning of potential animal abuse. So I guess skip ahead if you don't want to listen to this one. My brain hurt trying to process the things I'd learned. Derek had never mentioned his family or that he, by blood, had a claim to the building. He was always so in tune with it. It made sense, but it was never something I'd considered. I woke up on the sofa that morning confused. I had no idea how to continue. The vine had grown almost the entire perimeter of the flat, carefully weaving between my furniture and appliances, its waxy exterior reflecting sunlight from the windows. It stopped at the bedroom door, not crossing the threshold to Jamie's prison. I bit the bullet and decided to call Terry. I hadn't spoken to her since her and the kids' visit a few days prior, and I wanted to see if she remembered Derek ever talking about his brother, or if she knew of any basement. Terry had grown up in the building. She was bound to have explored more thoroughly than Mr. Prentice. Before I could get to any of that, I owed her an apology. My interaction with her had been rude, and I had been too distracted to check on her the past few weeks. I had been a terrible friend. I hit dial on the video chat and waited for a response. When she picked up the phone, she looked even worse than she had the last time I saw her. The dark circles were beginning to look like deep, inky tattoos permanently strained on her face. Still, she smiled, just like she always did. "Terry, are you okay? I'm so sorry about the other day. It's fine, Kat. I understand. Everything with Miss Beckham must have brought back some tough feelings for you. I should have waited a day or two. I'm sorry." My heart melted as she spoke. I never had such a loyal and genuine friend. Thank you. Don't be sorry. It helped seeing you guys. How are you doing? I asked. Well, I'm okay. The kids aren't behaving great at night. I'm not sure if lockdowns got to them or something else. I have to watch everything that they do. The other day I caught Eddie trying to take apart the washing machine with his claws. By the time I stopped him, Ellie had ripped up the shower curtains trying to climb them. She sounded defeated and, at best, definitely not okay. I wish I were allowed to help. I miss you, I sighed, longing for the day that I could sit and drink tea with her. Are you okay, Kat? You haven't been yourself, she asked. We may not have known each other that long, but she could sense when things weren't right. Terry was the epitome of an empath. This, I'd come to realize over the months, had been the only reason she kept in touch with Prudence. She's just so damn nice. I'm not. I don't know if you know about Essie's predictions, but she made one for me, and it sent me to some strange places. I'll tell you more when I figure out how, but for now I need your help. I still chose to omit Jamie from my confessions, but I was ready to be a bit more open. I wasn't too ashamed to admit I needed help. Terry clearly knew about Essie's gift. She didn't bat an eyelid. Anything. Do you remember Derek ever mentioning a brother? Even when you were growing up? I asked. Oh, not at all. Derek was always on his own, just appearing when we needed him. I was really young when he first disappeared though, so I don't remember him well, and might not be the one to ask. Terry's face scrunched up in thought as she racked her brain. I'm going to send you something. I minimized the video chat and copied the photo from the email onto my phone and sent it to her via text. Her video paused for a moment as she did, and the same to check the attachment. He was the first to live here, Terry. His dad built the place. Terry's video clicked back on. Where did you find this? She asked. I explained the blog and why I had been looking. It wasn't a short explanation, so I'll spare you that. We even broke from the seriousness briefly for the kids to come and fawn over the kittens. Eddie loved how Mr. Meow, whilst Ellie wanted to kidnap Tetley. Pringles was just curled up with me. He was my secret favorite anyway. Terry was fascinated by the vine. She wondered if it had a connection to Derek, especially given the photo I'd found on my search. I can't say the thought hadn't crossed my mind either. I learned more about him every day, but he would always first and foremost be the gardener. The vine made sense, but the basement didn't. I was struggling to connect it to the brothers. I don't know about a basement cat, but if this place is as old as you say, then who knows? I know I may look haggard. She pulled on her cheeks and giggled, but I'm really not that old. I laughed. I was sad that she didn't have any more information, but it was nice to talk to a friend for 5 minutes. Life felt normal. I kept my secret, and talking to Terry, I almost managed to forget about Jamie myself. If it hadn't been for the deep bite wound on my finger from the feeding the day before and the open cuts on my chest from his attack, I might have been successful. I still had no idea what the riddle Essie had given me meant. I was looking as hard as I could, and it had led me down a rabbit hole that just kept spewing more questions. What I did know was that with Jamie's seemingly permanent change in demeanor, I was running out of time. The growling hadn't stopped. The look of pure hatred as I dropped food didn't end, and I was getting frightened. Something had to give. Either Jamie was going to die or I would. There wasn't another option I could see, and the former may have been entirely unachievable. Derek destroyed Lila, but he never returned after. Prudence claimed that she killed the original wave of the creatures by setting light to them all on the already burnt out 9th floor. Again, something entirely unachievable without Derek's presence. I had to find him. I said my goodbyes to Terry, promised that I would update her when and if I could, and left to do my daily errands for Mr. Prentice and the couple next door. As I left the exit, I spotted a man going into Miss Beckham's flat. I recognized him as the son that I'd always seen visiting, eyes glazed with tears. Terry had said that she would get Molly to inform Essie's family, but I couldn't imagine what Molly might have said happened. I should have gone to him, just as a human being, tried to comfort him, but I couldn't bring myself to do it without an explanation to offer. I promised myself that I would visit him when the lockdown was over, and knew why his mother was gone. I rushed out and completed my errands as quickly as possible, eager to get home. Even having the name Albert Miles might have been helpful if I had just kept digging on the internet. After I dropped off the bags at Percy and Sylvia's door, I turned the key in my own, entered and shut it behind me like I always would. That was where the normality ended and my life was disrupted by an uninvited guest. When I turned to face the flat and caught a glimpse of my old fold-out table, there was a tall figure stood right next to it. Albert, like Derek, was a little older than he had been in the photo. There was a family resemblance, but the eyes weren't the same. Albert's weren't warm and kind, they were cold and filled with malice. He wore a suit similar to the one in the picture, but it wasn't as sharp. It was covered in a thick layer of dust and tattered, with loose threads hanging everywhere like clothes that had been dug out of a box in the attic. He grinned at me. It was smug, like something you might expect from a slimy car salesman. It's been a long time since I had to visit any of the residents up here. I like what you've done with the place. Much more modern than when that old bint before you lived here. I was frozen to the spot. I hadn't been alarmed when his brother had appeared inches from me on a bench, but something about Albert was much more sinister. I thought of his son, dead on the balcony, playing on repeat in my mind. Why are you here? I asked. He laughed, as the smug grin extended across his cheeks. I like you. You didn't even pretend to not know who I am. You know, Kat, I've always appreciated a person who cuts the small talk. It's better in business than in life. That trait will hold you in good stead. He was animated as he spoke, just gesticulating wildly. You didn't answer my question. Don't you find that ironic, considering your statement? I answered back, still terrified, but finding that keeping him talking might somehow help the situation. I don't need to answer your question. You know why I'm here. He continued to grin, raising an eyebrow and adjusting the torn sleeves of his suit. It's not often that I come across a tenant that causes as much chaos as you do. It's usually issues with the rent, and even something like that hasn't happened for quite some time, but you are something special. He stamped on the part of the vine that was growing near his feet, and I watched as the enormous structure withered and shrunk in size, as if it were in notable pain. The beginning of my entire ordeal flooded back to me. I was back in my kitchen, discovering Prudence's note for the first time, reading the one rule that I had never learned anything more about. 1. The landlord will never bother you. He doesn't visit, call, or communicate in any way, but make sure you pay rent in a timely fashion always. I've only dealt with him once in 35 years, and let's just say I never missed another rent day. Any repairs required, you speak to the agent you rented the place with. Rule number 1. So much happened that I hadn't thought much about that rule, but there must have been a reason she put it first, before even mentioning the creatures. Suddenly, the literal monster in my closet seemed soft and fluffy in comparison to the ageless man stood in front of me. I've paid my rent. Why are you here? I said firmly, curling my shaking hands into a fist. It was more for comfort than aggression. On the surface, I was hoping it could appear I was standing my ground. The rent part was true. It was hard, but I always found a way. I was still training to teach and pulled in extra cash running after school closed as I trained. Even during lockdown, I was creating digital learning tools. This place was my home, and I'd followed the first rule to the letter to keep it. Maybe you aren't as bright as I thought. He rolled his eyes. Let's list reasons a landlord might want to visit, shall we? Damage to property, unauthorized modification of communal spaces, digging around where it's not wanted or needed, nurturing my brother's unnatural experiments. He wanted to continue, but I stopped him. Hi, Proxy. Welcome in. What do you mean, unnatural experiments? Albert laughed even harder than before. I could see in his eyes that he considered me entirely dense by this stage. You think those 3 little abominations you took in came out of nowhere? They were a cry for help, you stupid girl, like a flare. And all you could do was pick it up and let it burn your fingers, he scoffed, laughing at his own bad joke. My heart sunk, wondering where the kittens were, and if he'd hurt them. After all the trouble you caused when he helped you last time, I wasn't going to let my idiot brother continue to roam my halls. Especially not after what you did once he was gone. I gulped. I knew exactly what he was talking about. He knew that I knew as well. Albert was more than a few steps ahead of me. I realized that Prudence destroying his garden had probably never banished Derek at all. He had been kept prisoner by the man in front of me. If Albert could keep someone with Derek's knowledge and abilities trapped, then I didn't stand a chance. Shall we talk about that thing you keep in your bedroom, Cat? I didn't mean to. I'm so sorry. I've regretted it since, I stuttered. I felt a tear run down my cheek as I anticipated imminent death. I know that. You wouldn't have even known how if my brother hadn't told the last woman. And he pretends to be so pious. The smile on his face disappeared. Even the thought of Derek left him with a scowl. He just tried to help the residents here, please. I made a mistake, I protested, anticipating that I was about to die, or even worse. Albert didn't speak. He just huffed in frustration and turned to walk towards the bedroom. I followed him, trying not to stay too close. The floor was trailed with blood, and as he entered the room, I noticed the wardrobe door was practically shattered. You couldn't even contain your mistake properly. He gestured to Jamie, who was in the corner. Oh, hunched over the blood-smothered body of a kitten that he was crunching on the bones of. Tiny bits of muscle and skin and pools of blood littered the floor. His eyes beady and black. Any semblance of Jamie I'd once seen in them was gone. I noticed Tetley and Wrinkles shivering together in the opposite corner, trying to hide from the monster. The brief relief I felt that they hadn't all met the same fate was interrupted when Jamie started to growl at Albert, baring his crimson-splashed teeth as menacingly as he could. I watched in horror as Albert just stood there, staring at the increasingly angry beast. The creature I had been hiding for all these months lunged at him aggressively, claws outstretched. Albert wasn't fazed. He barely even moved a muscle. Just reached out a tattered sleeve and waited for Jamie to make contact with his hand. The second Jamie touched Albert, he let out the most almighty, inhuman scream you could imagine. It felt like my eardrums were about to burst, and I instinctively put my hands over them. Albert put his hand back down by his side as Jamie fell in a heap to the floor. He wasn't moving. Not like when I stabbed him with the poker. He wasn't just still, he was dead still. The heap of fur he had become started to morph on the floor, his jaw pulled inwards as if he were dislocating, and his limbs began to stretch and shed their fur. After a while, Jamie was laid there on the floor. Not the rat Jamie. The real one. The one I'd spent years with and searched for a home with. The one who knew me before all this shit ever happened. And he was dead too. For real this time. It took everything I had to not throw myself on the floor with him. I stopped myself multiple times, but Albert's eyes bore into my soul and rendered me unable to move a muscle. I tried to fight back tears, but I couldn't. Don't bother to cry. He died a long time ago. Albert kicked Jamie's corpse and bent down into a squat to get closer to him, not taking his eyes off me. I didn't let him out, if that's what you were thinking. No, Cat. You did when you locked an angry animal in a cage. Eventually, they will all get free. I whimpered a little as he inspected the remains of my boyfriend, intensely taking in his hair and eyes. My brother had this preconceived notion that humans can live in harmony with the evil that inhabits this building. He's wrong, Cat. We can't. Eventually, it drives us all mad. Your mistake made such an unusual racket that I had to come and see what was going on. Did you ever imagine keeping him like that before you lived here? Of course not. Well, thank you for the follow. Enjoy your stay. I tried to interject, but he wouldn't let me. He was in full-blown monologue. This place fucks us up, Cat. You can't make it any better, regardless of how many shrubs you plant outside. He stroked Jamie's cold, dead face gently, barely touching it with his fingertips. The body evaporated beneath him, becoming nothing more than a pile of dust on my carpet. I hadn't even got to touch him one last time. Albert stood back up, salesman grin plastered back on his face, and brushed his sleeves. I've cleaned your mistake. Aren't you going to say thank you? I held back the bile that was forming in my throat, took a deep breath, and summoned every ounce of strength that I could just to speak. He was right. This place had fucked me up. But losing your partner like that would do the same to anyone. I thought of the little boy in the mirror, Mr. Prentice, even Ellie and Eddie. This wasn't for me. You're wrong about this place. Not everything here is evil. I made a mistake, but it's you that's evil. You killed your own son. What I did came from love, I blurted, trying to organize my thoughts. You don't know a damn thing about my son, and you won't. This is your only warning, Cat. Stop digging into my family. Consider my brother dead, and keep quiet. He spoke sternly. I didn't dare to talk back again. Despite knowing I'd hit a nerve, everything about him set me on edge. He took another vicious stamp on part of the vine as he exited the bedroom. It shriveled entirely underneath his dusty dress shoes, back to the size that I had been when I pulled my foot free. Except it wasn't green anymore. It was brown and rotten. He turned to me once more before he reached the front door of the flat to leave and spoke. If you dare continue your pointless little mission to try and find Derek, you will meet the same fate as that blind old bat from down the hall. People here will always do as I tell them. Let there be an example of why we do not meddle in my family business. Feel lucky that I didn't eviscerate you on the spot. Or worse. He winked at me, knowing that he had complete control of the situation, and left with a simple, bye for now, Cat. As the door slammed, the 2 remaining kittens bounded to my feet, shaking with fear. I scooped them up despite the burning and held them close. I wasn't going to let anything happen to them. The flat had an emptiness I wasn't used to, even when it was just me, with no kittens. Before I repeated the ritual to bring Jamie back as the creature, there was the comforting knowledge that he existed somewhere. There was hope. The pile of dust on my bedroom floor and the shattered remains of my wardrobe were all I had left of him now. Then there were Mr. Meow's remains, a glaring reminder of my failure to keep anything alive or safe. I cried for him as I scooped his parts into a shoebox ready to bury in the garden the next day. It was all my fault. Jamie, Mr. Meow, Esther, they were all dead because of me. I considered calling Terry back, telling her what happened, but I decided to keep my mouth shut. My stupidity had already cost lives, and I wasn't prepared to risk her or the kids. They really were family to me. I wasn't about to give up, though. All the heartache I caused, the tears of Essie's son, and the months my boyfriend spent trapped in the body of a vile beast, maybe they wouldn't be in vain if I was able to save Derek from his brother. The empty, gaping grief that I felt left me perfectly accepting of the prospect of a suicide mission. I cuddled the kittens and felt the skin of my arm start to melt and sizzle. If they really were a cry for help, I had to listen. I just couldn't let it go. In the next chapter, I never liked that damn lift. The shoebox I'd placed Mr. Meow in sat atop my fold-out table. As I lit my morning cigarette and sipped a cup of tea, I wondered if it was disrespectful to smoke next to a body. I decided that disrespect was in the eye of the beholder. I'd often thought of Essie as I smoked, remembering how we bonded over a few spare cigs. It hadn't made me feel disrespectful. I was smoking more than usual with the stress I was under too. I found it was a welcome few minutes break from my life. I wanted to sit on my balcony that morning and try to get some light and escape from the claustrophobic feel of the flat. I knew that my determination to find Derek, it might be the last I saw the sun, but the window cleaner was out there, just howling and scratching at the door. To be honest, the flat felt so empty without Jamie, Mr. Meow, or even the vine, that for a moment I almost considered letting him in. The longer I lived in the building, the less I thought of the window cleaner as a sinister entity. It was more pitiful than anything, and let's get realistic, I had grown accustomed to being surrounded by monsters. Since lockdown, he'd stopped bothering with the niceties and chit-chat. Instead, he just whined and scratched like a scared animal. Those wrinkles intently rubbing themselves up against my thankfully covered legs that stopped me from just giving up and opening the sliding door. I spent hours in the flat that day dwelling on everything, coming up with wild plans and theories in my mind. I texted Terry and asked her to check on Mr. Prentice for me. She asked what was going on, and I said I would tell her when I could. It was weak, but she accepted my explanation, or lack of, as always, with no questions asked. I must have paced the length of the flat hundreds of times. None of the ideas I had to help Derek seemed to develop into anything solid. It was frustrating, like trying to solve an impossible riddle. I analyzed every part of my interaction with Albert, trying to find hidden meanings amongst the words in my head. I wondered if he could communicate with the creatures, just like Derek had when he struck the deal over the lift. Maybe that's why he had to come to visit my flat when Jamie finally escaped. It would make sense if they were communicating all along. Maybe he'd been the reason for Jamie's aggression towards the end. I knew I wasn't going to find Derek without also finding Albert, so I decided that working to find the older of the brothers would be easier. Translating all my loose threads of thoughts into a plan didn't come easy. I tried to stop myself multiple times, worrying that I was going down the wrong route. But when it finally hit me, I knew that I had nothing better. Eventually, I settled on my next steps. I started after I had fed the kittens and washed up the bowls, after they'd fallen asleep on the sofa, after I had time to dwell in stress, after it got dark outside and no human residents were left in the dimly lit corridors. I had little faith in my plan, and I didn't want to risk anyone getting hurt as a byproduct. I made my way down the stairs, carrying the shoebox coffin in my arms and a small bag of dust that Jamie had left behind in my pocket. Shovel wedged in the gap between my arm and the torso. "Good evening, Marcus," I greeted the man on floor 5 with less enthusiasm than usual. He responded the same way he always did. "Not at all." The boy in the mirror blew more raspberries, making moose horn antlers with his hands and giggling. I waved back and tried to understand how Albert could consider every single special resident evil. These beings had become my family over time. The outside of the building was empty again. A city that usually never slept was taking the nap of a lifetime. I felt peaceful in the garden with the breeze blowing my hair around. The park opposite was eerily mystical under the stars. It was warmer than it had been a few nights before when I'd first discovered the kittens and the grate. Even though it only had been a short time, that night felt a lifetime away. I fought the urge to sob as I dug the tiny grave amongst the shrubs I'd found them in, and for the first time since Essie's death, I was successful. My mind was so focused on my goals that I managed to pull myself together and not become a wreck. I wasn't sure I had any tears left. I made full speeches instead, first to Mr. Meow and then to Jamie, who I sprinkled on top of the buried shoebox, vowing that I would do something good in all this before covering them back up with dirt. I stood and stared at the patch of soil for a while. At one point, I could have sworn I caught a glimpse of the metal grate, but it was gone in a blink, replaced by a flat, gray concrete. Either Albert was teasing me, or I was getting completely mad. I felt my heart start to pound through my chest as I re-entered the building. What I was preparing to do was dangerous and potentially deadly, but it was better than never knowing if I could have done more. I didn't want to spend a lifetime imagining Derek trapped and alone. Every time my life is in crisis in this place, I seem to find myself outside the lift, and that night was no different. Even if everything in me was telling me to flee up the stairs and drop it, there I was, staring at the huge metal doors. I had killed friends, taken me to places no one else could see, and housed monsters that infected my nightmares. As my own heart continued to pound, I imagined that the lift could be considered the building's heart, carrying human life to every floor like we were the blood of the tower. My eyes flitted from the intimidating metal doors to the display on my phone. I was a few minutes early, and those few minutes felt like 1,000 years. I edged as close as I could to that button to call the lift. As soon as the numbers changed, I knew it was time to start. 1:11 a.m. I jabbed the button violently, took a deep breath, and reached into my pocket. It was hard to fight back the bile as I pushed out Mr. Meow's severed foot that I had carefully plucked from the shoebox earlier, but I managed and I threw it. It landed about 3 meters or so from the lift's entrance. I retreated and stood to the edge of the stairs, just out of sight, my entire body shaking as I waited for the rattling noise of the opening doors. The first part of my plan worked as well as I could have hoped for, and soon, for the first time, I was faced with my boyfriend's killers. I'd only seen Jamie and Prudence's granddaughter Lila's iterations of the monsters in person. The creatures that they were spawned from had remained largely a mystery to me, and I never considered that they could be different from what I had already experienced. They were larger, much larger, than Jamie or Lila had been. I remembered what Derek had said about the survivors strengthening with each one that dies. They were probably the same height as a fully grown adult male with fur-covered, defined muscular limbs. They maintained the posture of a rat and had long razor-sharp teeth protruding from their elongated jaws. Their eyes were different to Jamie's too. Instead of having beady black, they had bright daffodil yellow sheen. I thought what was living in my wardrobe had been frightening, but this was nothing compared to them. The two huge rodent humanoid creatures skulked out of the lift. They were on their hind legs, but their backs were hunched over in a way that would have allowed them to break into a four-legged sprint at any moment. They started to edge towards the kitten foot, sniffing at it intensely. Knowing I had moments before they smelled me too, I left my corner by the stairs and started sprinting towards the open metal doors. I hoped that releasing the creatures during their frenzy would be enough to summon Albert. He didn't seem to appreciate the scene. If I could just hide in that awful metal box for long enough, he would have to come, and if they weren't in there with me, then I would be safe. My stress and sleep deprivation had got to me. I knew my plan was severely flawed, and I hadn't properly considered the risks. When I finally made it inside the doors, I was confronted with the worst consequences that I could have imagined. Unsurprisingly, they spotted me. As I hammered on the button that should close the doors and lock me in, I could see them snarling, long strings of saliva stretching from their mouths to the splatter on the floor as they prepared to run towards me. I was ready to die. I was almost certain that it was going to happen in that moment. That was until I spotted the tiny figure weaving through the creature's legs. It was fast, and I could barely make it out. It was growling and making noises that seemed to genuinely frighten them. Long claws slashed at the rat creature closer to reaching me, and it yowled in pain as it fell to the floor. Horns first, the figure managed to enter the lift just before the doors began to seal themselves. It hissed at the uninjured creature, keeping him backed away just enough for us to hear the thud of the metal doors closing. Most would be terrified of anything that could frighten off the worst nightmares in an instant, let alone being locked in a 4x4 space with them. But not me. As the figure became clear, I was both proud and devastated. Ellie? What are you doing here? Your mom's gonna kill us both! Terry's young daughter sat herself down cross-legged in the corner of the tiny room as I slid down one of the walls to the floor myself, hugging my knees. I broke into hysterical tears. I couldn't believe I put Ellie at risk. I knew about the twins' late-night escapes. She shuffled over next to me, her horns pinched a little as she nuzzled my shoulder, but I didn't care. Don't cry, Cat. Did you see how scared of me those things were? She's delighted. Her smile lit up, and if you could have seen anything in the deep black voids that replaced her eyes, you would have seen a childlike excitement. The creature outside scraped and hammered at the door, and I could still hear the pain screams of ones she'd impaled. For a small child, she had no idea of the impact she just made. It was hard to comprehend how a little girl could cause so much damage. You shouldn't be out. Why aren't you at home? Is Eddie out too? Your mom will go looking. What if they get her? I started ranting. Ellie's face dropped immediately. I usually would have felt awful, but I couldn't shake the thought of her whole family being killed because of me. Of the other people that might be in mortal danger. How could I be so fucking stupid? Eddie's at home playing with his truck and Mom fell asleep. I just wanted to come and explore and I was playing on the stairs when I saw you. I missed you, Cat. Are they gonna eat Mom? Her little voice cracked as she started to sob. I wanted to reassure her and tell her that they wouldn't, but I didn't want to lie. I started to understand the gravity of what I had just released. I was still confident that my original plan would bring Albert out of the basement. However, I wasn't so confident that Albert would just let Ellie go. He might see her as evil, like he saw everything else here. I had to do everything I could to protect her. Esther Beckman's ridiculous prophecy played in my mind once again, and I silently cursed her. How many more friends are going to be in danger, Esther? Why would you be so fucking vague? I tried to calculate a comforting yet honest response for Ellie, but I failed. Before I had a chance to speak, the metal prison we were trapped in started to whir and crunch, shaking and making awful mechanical noises. I tried desperately to press the button for Terry's floor and hoped that I could still drop off Ellie unharmed, but it didn't work. Instead, the box started to fall and the lift traveled downwards. It wasn't high-tech enough for a digital display. Instead, the buttons light up as you reach each floor. Not a single button lit as we fell much faster than any lift should, for what must have been at least 5 minutes. Ellie was screaming. I couldn't do much but to hold her hand, being careful to interlock my fingers in a way that wouldn't result in a claw through my own. I watched the button panel the entire time, occasionally trying to press on any number I could. Every attempt was futile. The lift ground to a halt. And we were thrown into the air as it stopped with a huge clap. Just underneath the numbered buttons had appeared a shrewdly drawn -1 scratched into the metal. I knew it hadn't been there before. It could only signify one thing. I'd done it. I made it to the basement. As I looked at Ellie, I couldn't help but wonder, at what cost? Was any of this worth the danger that I'd accidentally put her in? I hadn't accounted for the extra person, or the lift falling. My plan ended when I threw the foot and ran. In my optimistic mind, Albert would have killed the creatures outside to avoid a scene and have to talk to me again, without being able to kill me like Essie. I knew squeezing Ellie's hand that I misjudged the situation entirely. Where are we? She asked nervously. I don't know for sure. I think this is the basement, I replied. But the block doesn't have a basement. I know. The door slowly opened to reveal a huge darkened flat. It was luxury, like an underground penthouse, but without a single window in sight. It was largely empty, not a soul inside. I stood up from the floor of the lift, Ellie's hand still firmly gripped in mine. Thank you for the follow. I hope you enjoy your stay. Ellie's hand still firmly gripped in mine and tried to take in the surroundings. The lift had stopped directly in what seemed to be a living room. There was no hallway or corridor leading to the set of flats like the lift usually stopped. In the room was a black velvet sofa, a few side tables, and an almost useless lamp providing a dim glow in the corner. It lit up a few twinkling cobwebs and made it just about possible to see a huge trailing pot plant sat on a table that matched perfectly with the vine that had wrapped itself around my foot, and then my home. The lack of a nearby grate didn't bode well. Ellie started to cry. I couldn't see actual tears with the voids for eyes, but I could hear her soft whimpers. Hi, I'm enjoying the reading. I'm glad. I searched my mind again for something comforting, for some comforting thoughts, but I couldn't find a single one. If I was right, and Derek was trapped here, we were fucked. Attempts to jab the buttons were pointless. It was as if the lift had run out of battery. We couldn't even close the doors. I took a step into the room and Ellie followed. Before I could say a word, we heard the metal doors clap together, and by the time we turned around, the lift had been replaced by a blank wall. "Where the fuck are you?" I screamed desperately, hoping that Albert's smug face would just appear from the shadows. It didn't. All my plea did was terrify Ellie, who continued to grip my hand. It's awful to say, but I was partly grateful that she was here, if only so that I didn't have to be alone. "Who are you looking for?" she questioned. "Someone that can help us get home. I need you to stay close to me all the time. Can you do that for me, please?" I hoped with my whole being that I could keep her safe. Ellie simply nodded in response, her horns bobbing in the dim glow. I took a few steps in the direction of the plant, reaching out to touch it, and see if it was limp or alive, like the version in my flat had been. I was disappointed that it was the former. As I ventured further into the room, I noticed that the opposite wall wasn't nearly as blank as the one that had replaced the lift. Instead, indented in the wall were another set of metal doors, identical to the ones that had closed and vanished behind us. Next to the left side of the door was a button with the words "Call Lift" carved into the metal above it. It gave me a great feeling of unease. Despite my unease, I saw no other exit to the room, and before I could even consider options, my tiny companion had pressed the button. Even demon kids love buttons. As the doors opened, relief washed over me to see that it was empty, and not full of even more creatures. We took a step inside, and I found myself once again staring at the button panel. This time, I wasn't searching for a floor 9. In fact, I yearned for the days when that was my biggest problem. The panel was much like the one in the lift we got here in, except alarmingly, every number came with a minus symbol before it, and there was no sign of a G for the ground floor. There isn't a guide for these floors. Looking at that button panel in the lift that didn't lead home, I felt a knot form in my stomach. Why hadn't Albert appeared? And which button was I supposed to press? "Where are we going, Cat?" Ellie asked. She had stopped crying, but every word was heavy with fear. In truth, I didn't really know the answer to her question. I stared at the panel, taking in every number and noting its inclusion of a -9. "We're going to see if there's anyone else around," I answered. I didn't like my chances with whatever inhabited that floor. If wherever we what? I'm sorry, this sentence is written kind of weird. If wherever we were was a reverse of the building, the number 9 could be nasty, so I started cautiously pressing the -2 button. The mechanic's word and the large metal doors clapped shut. I wish that I had been behind the real lift's doors before it disappeared from sight. The lift that stood in was identical to the original as possible. Even the shiver it sent up my spine just being inside it felt the same. I was grateful when it stopped at the doors open to reveal a relatively normal looking corridor reminiscent of the ones in the upper building. I would have believed that I'd imagined the lift falling and was arriving home if it weren't for the large black -2 painted next to the metal doors, the lack of any windows, and an obnoxious artificial light that I was sure would give me a migraine if I stood there for too long. I don't know what I hoped for would be behind the red wooden door that led to a vast stretch of flats. I didn't suppose that finding Derek in something that the fake lift had indicated was as large as the building would be that simple, but perhaps it would provide some answers. Albert himself was a possibility. I couldn't predict his moves, but I had a strange feeling he wouldn't be able to contain his intellectual gloating at the failure of my plan for long. I don't like it here. The small voice broke my stream of thoughts. Me neither, Ellie. Hopefully someone will be home and know how we can get back upstairs. I feebly attempted to smile at my tiny companion. But she was a child, not an idiot. She saw straight through me. I don't think we should go through that door. Ellie gestured to the red wooden door separating us from the windowless flats. She planted her tiny feet firmly to the spot and refused to move any further. Do you have any better ideas? I asked, genuinely hopeful. I just have a really bad feeling. Her words didn't fill me with a sense of comfort or optimism, but I saw little choice. I reached for the handle and pulled at the door. It creaked loudly as it opened, releasing a strong, musky smell, like something that had been shut away for a long time. Excuse me. I took a tentative step inside alone, leaving Ellie just behind in the corridor, and shouted hello, hoping that if anyone was in there, that visitors were usually scarce and they may come out. Unlike my previous plans, this worked flawlessly, and within minutes each of the doors were opening slowly. I counted around 10 doors in total as human arms and fingers started to emerge from behind them. The flats were filled with, and I use this term loosely, people. They weren't typical, none of them were dressed, and they had fleshy limbs and appendages sticking out from all the wrong places. They were elongated necks, multiple arms and spines bent completely backwards. It shocked me that any of them could walk at all. Each one of them looked like a unique result of intense torture. Torture that should have killed them long before they reached the stage they were at. Remembering where I was, I realized that they probably were killed long ago. Or they never lived to begin with. One in particular caught my eye. It had a neck at least 3 feet long, and I couldn't distinguish its gender at all. Its back was bent in a way that a child might do the crab walk, and it was balanced on all fours. Instead of 2 arms and 2 legs, all 4 limbs were left arms, all facing the same direction. Its neck lolled backwards, swinging from side to side, a little and struggling to support itself. I inhaled sharply as its head lifted slightly to a steadier position, and it locked eyes with me. It screamed. The scream that came from that thing was the single most distressing sound I've ever had to listen to. It penetrated my soul, and I felt every inch of pain and suffering that laced it. My stomach churned, and the shrill pitch burrowed into my brain. It left me completely immobile as every other person-like creature in the room lifted its head wherever it balanced and screamed in unison with the first. Holding my hands to my ears, I started to feel a warm liquid trickling from them, but I couldn't take my only protection away to see what it was. I can't even begin to describe the pain that I felt. There are no words for a misery that deep. I don't know how, but I could feel years upon years of torment and unimaginable pain that they'd gone through. The screaming became so overwhelming and all-consuming that I started to feel myself getting dizzy. There was a violent tug at my shirt, forcing me backwards before an almighty hiss, vicious enough to cut through the screams and silence them, echoing through the corridor. It took seconds for each and every one of the mangled people to shrivel back into their flats, winding limbs clamoring in all directions, leaving Ellie stood there, horn tips gleaming in the artificial light. are they, Cat? I barely heard the muffled sound she was making that had replaced the heart-wrenching screams. I finally pulled my hands away from my ears to see them covered in blood. Ellie noticed and wrapped her arms around me, nicking me accidentally in the side with a claw. It hurt, but I didn't want to make a fuss. In that moment, I knew no pain could measure up to what I'd felt during my short time amongst the mangled people. How did you do that? I could still barely hear the sounds of my own voice. It was like I was wearing a hat pulled over my ears, despite nothing of the sort, and my hair being shoved into a bun on top of my head. I didn't do anything. I thought they were going to eat us both, she replied, hyped on the adrenaline. But they all ran away. I guess I'm just extra scary, she answered, a pride in her voice that only a child could produce. I just looked down at her and ruffled the blonde hair between her horns. She was frightening looking, sure, but she had nothing on those things, or even the creatures in the lift. I couldn't understand why such ferocious monsters were so scared of a little girl. Why would they run instantly? It made me uneasy, but I loved the twins, no matter how unusual they were. I just wished that I could be more of a protector for her than it being the other way around. We stumbled into the corridor, and I was again confronted by the metal doors of the fake lift. To the other side of them, there was an entrance, presumably to a stairwell if the undertower we were trapped in continued to be a mirror of a home. After spending what felt like hours in a lift, the idea of stairs comforted me, and I ushered Ellie towards the entrance. There were no stairs going back to floor -1. They only went downwards, the odd artificial lighting not quite covering the bottom of the set we were at the top of. My ears rung with the sound of the mangled people's screams. What are these monsters? Really quick recap. Our main character has moved into an anomalous apartment building, and she deals with these weird monsters and creatures on a regular basis. And now we're getting to the point where we've met the landlord, and we need his brother for help, and we've managed to get into the quote-unquote basement of this building. Do you think they skipped too? Ellie asked me, looking to the abyss with her own impossibly deep black voids. What's the name of the book? It's actually not a book. It is a Reddit story thread. Let me see. See if I can post the whole story in chat here. Yeah. There we go. So this would be like the first chapter. We are apparently in season 2, we're quite the ways through. Loving the voice for the children, thank you. Well, let's find out, I answered, gripping her hand again as we started to walk towards the darkness. We reached floor -3 quickly, in one average flight. I considered exploring the corridor of flats that existed on the floor too, but Ellie planted herself firmly to the ground again and insisted we didn't. I wasn't about to argue with her. Sound still hadn't returned to normal, and I'd learned from my mistake. I couldn't bear to face anything like the previous floor again. We climbed down another flight of stairs. The ones we had just ascended were still there, leading back up. When we reached the bottom, giving me some comfort that as long as we could reach the lift on floor -2, we should at least be able to get back to the cold, dim, but empty basement. This time, the stairs did skip, giving some sort of semblance of home. The big black -5 was jarring but missing a floor and allowed me to tell myself that these stairs were just an extension of the proper ones. More jarring was the woman. She looked right at us, at my demon sidekick, then had terrified everything else, and she didn't run. In fact, she didn't move at all. It's as if she were looking straight through us. Ellie didn't panic either. She didn't tell me to get away or hiss at the woman. She just stared back. Her hair was a mousy brown and her features beautiful, yet average. There was nothing particularly distinct about her, except for how much she reminded me of someone else. She was a perfect mirror of her counterpart. She had the same vacant yet sad expression that the man on the floor 5 always had. I wondered for a moment what her name might be. "She misses him," Ellie said. I looked down at her in confusion. "How do you know that?" I asked, not bothering to question who she meant. "I don't know. I just do," she shrugged nonchalantly. I sat on the step next to the standing woman and despaired. This whole place was like a sick joke. There was no sign of Albert, Derek, or any way out of the labyrinth we were trapped in so far, and I couldn't comprehend just how much of an imbecile I'd been. Between the thoughts of never getting out and how I endangered the entire block, how hungry the kittens would get, Jamie and those awful screams, my head felt ready to explode. The incessant ringing was only getting worse. The woman next to me didn't move a muscle, just stood staring into the open space in front of me. I looked at Ellie, knowing that she was special, and I didn't doubt what she had told me. I could feel for myself that the woman missed the man. I understood how she felt to lose her love to the building. My heart truly bled for her. "We need to keep going. There has to be someone here that can talk to us. We need to get you back home to your mom and your brother," I spoke, attempting to stay focused. I smiled another forced optimistic smile at Ellie and gestured for her to follow me further down the spiraling, artificially lit stairs. I wasn't sure what I hoped to find, or even where I was aiming. Perhaps floor -9 was my best bet at any sort of answers. I didn't get a chance to test that theory. Once we reached the bottom of the flight, we were once again faced with a big black -5. The woman was stood in the same position, facing forwards. "Come on." I grabbed Ellie and tried to repeat the action. The stairs had always skipped. It wasn't anything unusual. It wasn't, until it was. By the 6th time we had attempted the stairs, Ellie was looking tired and scared. Despite her voids for eyes, the rest of her face displayed fear like any normal child. "Cat." "It's okay. We just need to keep trying." I tried to convince myself as much as her. "No. She doesn't want to be alone. That's why we can't leave." She let go of my hand and extended a long clawed finger in the direction of the woman. She hadn't moved from her spot, and there wasn't a noticeable change in facial expression or demeanor. However, something about her felt entirely off. Hostile, even. I understood grief and doing everything possible to keep people close to you that you should let go. I wish that were what I thought the woman's intentions were. I really do. Instead, it felt more literal than that. More like she just really couldn't bear to be alone again, at any cost. Just keep going. We ran down the stairs again, then up them, then down again. 3 more times, and the terror started to build. Each time we arrived in the front of the -5, and the woman seemed more sinister, more malignant. She wasn't looking through us anymore. She was looking straight at us. "My legs hurt, Cat," Ellie whined. Mine did too. "Do you think you could scare her?" I felt sick even suggesting it, but Ellie had the best chances of getting us away from the stairwell. Ellie shook on the spot, but nodded and took a few steps towards her. She got close to the woman's face and hissed, claws out. The woman didn't move. She didn't blink or flinch at all. She just stayed in her spot. Nothing at first, until she started to move. All that changed was her face, as the corners of her lips curled into a hollow smile. The comfort I had felt from the familiarity of the woman and the floor number was dead in the water the moment she smiled. Ellie had retreated in an instant, tugging at my shirt again and shuffling closer. I think the fact that she did nothing else at all made it even more disconcerting. The woman had the upper hand, and she wasn't going to let us go. Please, I begged. If there's anything we can do to help you, please tell us. I fought my fear, doing everything I could to be kind. If she had ever been a person, she might somehow pity our plight. I say hello to your man. I don't know his name, and he's quiet like you. I think he misses you too. I know he does. I lost someone I love just like you did. I know how you feel. A singular tear rolled down her cheek, but the smile stayed in place. My chest thumped as my heart pounded against my ribcage. Maybe I was getting to her. Her eyes were haunting and hypnotic as they made contact with mine. It was like her brain was scrambled and she couldn't put the pieces back together. Her eyes were more expressive than I had ever seen before in any person, but filled with confusion and sadness. After a few moments of intimate communication with her eyes, the woman moved more than I had ever seen her or the man move. She cocked her neck to the side and tilted her head in Ellie's direction. A few seconds after, her neck had turned, her eyes followed, and she looked intensely at the child. A smile plastered on her face, and the evaporating trail of the tears still visible in the gleaming light. Ellie started to cry, terrified. She tried to take a step behind me to use me as some sort of shield. No matter how many monsters she fought, she was still a scared kid. The woman took a labored step towards her. It took her a long time to put one foot in front of the other. Standing in one position for so long must do a real number on the muscles, even for those of a supernatural persuasion. Nonetheless, her step was an immediate threat, and I could feel that her intentions were malevolent. The sadness in her eyes had developed into a disdain that a single step was a declaration of war. Me and Ellie started to back away slowly, readying ourselves to break into a sprint down the stairs. I was prepared to run to them in an endless loop forever if it meant keeping that little girl away from the woman. Before we could reach even the first step, there was a voice. A male voice. That's enough now, Angela. I didn't think you were one to make children cry. I turned to the man now standing next to the woman, who had returned to her spot by the stairs, visibly calmed. He had one hand on her upper arm, but he didn't need it there. She wouldn't dare disobey him. His kindly eyes and smile that held real warmth were arranged beneath a familiar flat cap. I wish I could say it were nice to see you, Cat, but given the circumstances, I better not. He continued, speaking directly to me this time. Who is he? Ellie interrupted, tugging the same spot on my shirt where the material had begun to stretch. I smiled at her for real for the first time since our nightmare began. Ellie, this is Derek. The man that we're looking for. This is the current chapter we're on, if you want to continue reading with me. How did we end up here? Pleased to meet you, young lady. Derek smiled at Ellie, a genuine warm grin. They had never met before. He only knew about the twins because I had told him about them last time we spoke. He never got a chance to see them before he disappeared. Despite this, he was completely unfazed by her demonic appearance. I wish more than anything that the circumstances had been better. Their meeting and our reunion would have been wonderful upstairs, but instead we were stuck in the artificially lit stairwell, with a now still again woman for company. I'd missed him. I hadn't realized how much it was possible to miss a person I barely knew until Derek. He represented everything good about the block to me. He made it feel like home, even in the bright, windowless underground layers. Pleased to meet you too, sir, Ellie answered in the poshest accent that she could muster, giggling. She radiated a light, There was an invisible expression of instant trust among the black that made up her voids. She liked him. When this nightmare began with the prophecy and subsequent death of Esther Beckman, I never would have imagined I'd be witnessing the moment between Ellie and Derek, to see an instant connection. I hoped he would get the chance to see her in the sunlight too, with her brown puppy dog eyes in the place of the voids. The whole scene filled me with my own warmth. Sounds were still muffled after my brutal attack by the mangled people, and I was disappointed that his voice wasn't clear, but the arrival of Derek gave me a great hope. Even the presence of the woman, who had still stood by the stairwell, couldn't break that. Besides, we were safe from her now. He took his kindly eyes away from Ellie to look at me. "Why are you here? How?" he asked, disbelief in his tone. There was no anger, just disappointment, which was arguably worse. It was the first time I had ever seen Derek not look calm and collected. "I'm here for you. I couldn't let you rot down here. I got the kittens and the vine. Then Albert came to visit," I blurted out quickly. Derek smiled a little, but it was strained. I'm sorry, Kat. You shouldn't have come here. How did you do it? Why is this little lady with you?" he replied, confusion building. He tried to hide the concern in his voice for Ellie's sake, but it was useless. She'd already seen the danger we were in. I explained what had happened, right from the very beginning, after he went away and Mr. Prentice trampled Prudence. Ellie stood in a frightening awe as I spoke about my monstrous boyfriend, how I'd brought him back, kept him locked away for months, and how he later murdered Mr. Meow. Derek looked worried as I described Albert's visit and threats. I covered everything, from Essie to the vine to the window cleaner and his inability to hold it together in the lockdown. I tried to reason why I had thought that my plan with the lift would work, but saying it out loud made me realize how stupid I had been. Ellie continued to listen intently. She looked a little smug when I told him how she had saved me from the creatures and again from the mangled people just a few floors above us. I could see that my explanation wasn't complete enough. Derek had had a million questions still to ask, but I didn't give him a chance. After months of dwelling on his disappearance and the events of recent weeks, it was my turn to ask questions. "Where are we?" I asked, starting as simply as I could manage. Little did I know, I had just opened Pandora's box with 3 words. Derek began to speak. "I call it the Under Tower, or the building below. It's still a part of the building, but most residents never see it, for good reason. The things that live here aren't always as friendly as those upstairs. When my father bought the land to build this place, he discovered a large underground tunnel system whilst digging the foundations, and it inspired him. He wanted to be the first architect to extend a skyscraper the same length downwards, and a good deal of the excavation was already in place. He wanted to maximize the earning potential of this space, but he hadn't accounted for the power of this land. My father was a competitive, secretive man, so naturally he told no one outside of his workers what he was planning, not even his family. He employed a team of contractors who all signed non-disclosure agreements. We're standing in the result." Derek waved his arms a little, gesticulating to our current setting before he continued. "When they found him hanging, he was in the basement, the grim-looking room you will have arrived here in. That room and everything below it has been untouched since construction. They gave up on expanding that particular floor when my father died. The underground project was abandoned. As is the nature of this land, the contractors started to report strange happenings across the entire tower. There were at least 5 unexplained deaths, and although it was unreported to the public, those were all amongst the men working below. Those that worked on this hidden part of the building were especially superstitious, and after my father's death, they sealed all entrances to the basement, entombing an entire tower block underneath the city. When it came into his possession, Albert tried to convince the builders to unseal it and carry on working. He was just like our dad, you see, ambitious and money-driven. None of them would agree to it. They claimed it was cursed. The upper tower was completed just before my father took his life, so Albert abandoned his negotiations with the contractors within a few weeks and focused on opening the place up. He wasn't going to continue to miss out on any money arguing over these lower floors. He had said that our father's death would be the only explain the grand opening being delayed for so long, and he had to move forward. We moved in a week later, the first residents to live here. He paused for a moment, and a sadness clouded his face. His kindly eyes welled up a little as he thought back to the life before the building.
You must really be old if your dad built this place. Even my mom isn't that old,
Ellie interrupted. I laughed. Her childish thought process was the only thing that could lighten the mood. Derek chuckled, and the woman next to him remained unmoving. I'm quite old, I suppose. I don't feel it, though, he answered, chuckling to himself as he adjusted his flat cap and winked at Ellie. Don't look it either, I chimed in. Derek stopped chuckling and continued, shooting me a look. That isn't something I can explain, Kat. Albert and I weren't close to our father. We didn't really know anything about this place until he died. The project was mostly completed, and we only got to speak to a handful of contractors who told us wild stories we would never believe to be true at the time. We couldn't have imagined how our lives were going to change. The only clue we have to our extended life is his note. To my boys, if you stay here, you will never die. That was all that he had left us, on a crumpled bit of paper that had been given to us by a builder named Keith. My best guess is that he made some kind of deal with the spirit of the place. I don't know, maybe it was just a special resident I haven't met yet. Maybe the building itself. It took us years to realize we weren't aging normally, and by the time we noticed, there was no one left to ask. We had to navigate every supernatural, unusual, and strange occurrence in the place, alone at first. I remembered exploring, being in awe of everything I met. Whenever I would cross paths with Albert, he didn't look mystified like I was. He was scared. My brother and I were never the best of friends, and it's my deepest regret that I didn't use that time we were alone here to build a relationship with him. Maybe I could have made a difference. A difference to what? I asked, trying to take in each of his words. To his son? Derek looked at Ellie, letting his eyes linger on the little girl and then back at me. He shook his head. Not now. There's far too much to discuss. For now, we need to find a way to get you home. I considered protesting, but I could see the sadness in his eyes and I didn't want to press. He was right. I put Ellie at risk for long enough, and I needed to get her back to Terry and Eddie safely. Have you been here this whole time? If you can't get out, then we have no hope. Oh, shit. Have you been here this whole time? If you can't get out, then we have no hope, I whispered to Derek as he put an arm around Ellie's shoulders and prepared to move. He sighed a little. You met my brother, Kat. The consequences of my escape would be huge for the block. He's not appreciative of the way I conduct myself. He prefers to take what the building gives and make it harmful, twist it into something bad. I prefer to live with it. I don't believe anything here is evil. Except maybe him. I tried to let it go, but I wanted to keep moving. But things weren't adding up. But Albert said, the kittens and the vine. He said that they were a cry for help. He lied. It's in his interest to keep me away. Yes, I helped them live. It gets lonely down here. When he discovered the plant, he took it off me immediately. Albert brought down one of the cats to feed it to the thing he keeps on the floor -10. I stopped him. He can't let me keep it because I suppose somewhere deep down he pitied me. I nurtured that little cat until out of nowhere the kittens were born. It was amazing. Love created a new creature, a new life. The cats were great company and I would have freed them if I could, but I never let them out. I didn't have a clue until they got out, until you mentioned the grate in the wall. He looked me up and down as he spoke, eyeing me unusually. It wasn't an entirely mistrustful look, but suspicious nonetheless.
So how do we get out?
Ellie asked. Well, last time your friend's garden got me out of here. He crouched to speak to her on eye level.
We planted a garden for you, but you never came.
She huffed in retort. I know. My mean brother told me how beautiful it is. I hope I get to see it one day. He's made it a bit harder this time. He stood up and addressed me again. I used to go through the basement. There's a stairwell. It's just sealed up. You have to break it. The lift will only bring you down. You can't get home that way. So let's go, I urged, reaching for his hand. Then I saw it. I hadn't noticed. I had been too focused on his kindly eyes. Derek was missing all 4 fingers on his left hand. He looked at the floor as I struggled to not stare. What he did to Jamie. If I even just enter the basement, it will happen to me. I tested it. You can see the results. He lifted his stumpy hand. I don't know how I got that cat to give birth, and I don't know how Albert does anything that he does to the things that live here. I just know that if I step in that basement, I will die. He looked devastated. Despite the relief that he hadn't gone straight in and done much worse damage, I knew the loss of his fingers would be major for him. He was, after all, first and foremost a gardener. I'll walk you there, Cat. Make sure Albert lets you go, but I can't come with you. I wanted to scream, loud enough to hurt any ears left on the mangled people upstairs. I wanted to shout and tell him that after all I'd been through, I wasn't going to leave without him. But the horned little girl beside me had thrown a lot of complications out there. Defeated, I nodded. Derek turned to the still woman. I'll be back to visit Angela, I promise. But please, let these ladies leave safely. He leaned over and kissed her cheek gently before ushering us towards the stairwell. Another single tear rolled down her face. We trudged upwards fairly silently. I wondered if all my questions would ever be answered. I knew from before that Derek was mysterious, but after all I'd been through to get to the Undertower, it didn't seem fair that I would be marched back so unceremoniously. Derek may have known the way to get home, but no single person has complete control of this land. And I was coming to really understand that. The building would always win. So I shouldn't have been surprised when we arrived at the large black -7. Cat. They skip. You know that. There's nothing for you in there. Derek put his stumpy hand on my shoulders as I stared up a different yet familiar corridor. You could see the curiosity filling my eyes as I was confronted with the counterpart of my home. Would it be filled with more mangled people? Or was it a true reversal, a place where me and Jamie lived happily? Mr. Prentice didn't have to deal with his affliction, and Essie was alive. Or was it home to something entirely different? Noise suddenly became more than just muffled. My mind was actively blocking it out. The knowledge that Derek was with Ellie took away some of the responsibility that I felt as I edged towards the familiar yet very different main entrance. Cat, please don't. Derek followed me, cautious to keep hold of Ellie. I think had she not been there, he probably would have grabbed me, but he didn't want to spook her. I continued towards in a trance-like state. -42. The numbers were blurred and the minus symbol stood out. I stroked the wood and the handle. It didn't feel like home. Not even a little. I was curious about what was inside, but I somehow knew that it wasn't good. The only seemingly positive thing about the situation was the lack of mangled people on the floor. I didn't know what was behind the door, but it wasn't them. I'd already created enough noise to draw them out if they were there. No, something else was there. Instead of trying my key, after a sudden epiphany, I turned and ran straight towards -51 and pounded on the door. "Essie!" I screamed, realizing that if I hadn't died in that lift, then maybe she hadn't either. I banged hard on the door and I could almost smell the familiar cigarette smoke seeping out of the flat. "Cat, stop!" Derek screamed. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see him covering Ellie's voids in a grim anticipation. Then the door squeaked open. There she was. Essie hadn't died at all. Her fate had been much worse. My friend was dead at the door, face twisted into a horrifying expression, her mouth lolled open much wider than should be possible with a functioning jaw. More alarmingly, her eyes had been entirely removed, leaving red, bloodied, gaping wounds central to her face. Tufts of hair had been yanked from her scalp, leaving raw skin in its place. The dress that's neatness I had previously marveled at was torn and distressed around the edges, barely covering her swollen, deformed limbs, bones jutting out of open wounds in all directions. The air filled with the scent of old ash and necrotic skin. She collapsed to the ground, unable to stand any longer on her broken legs, mouth still hanging open. Guilt washed hard over me. "How could you leave her like this?" I turned to Derek and screamed, but his face was horrified as mine. I didn't know, Kat. Honestly, I didn't. I didn't even know she was dead until I found you. Please, we have to keep going. Don't let her see this." He kept his hand over the gaping blank voids that were so much more alive and comforting than Essie's hollowed sockets. There was real shock in his eyes. I believed him, but I was angry. "She wanted me to help you, and this is what she got?" I couldn't get past my rage. Essie had been left to suffer for so long already, and who knew how long Albert intended her to stay like that. She laid there, writhing, and I was both desperate to help and furious. Derek didn't get a chance to protest. Instead, our argument was interrupted by a slow and mocking clap. I turned to see the door of flat -42 flung wide open. Albert in the doorway, with a smug grin on his face. Ooh. We might have to save this one for next time. Though, with this, we have 3 chapters left. So it'll be this one and then 2 more. So I hope you all have enjoyed this series by newtotownJAM. I have been really liking it, personally, so I hope you guys have been too. I will say though, it is quite late, and I probably won't raid anybody because no one is online. So thank you for hanging out with me. Thank you, Alpha Koki and Bratty Cthulhu. Thank you for the follows. Hope to see you next month when I do another reading. Anyone that is still here, I hope you have a lovely rest of your day. Stay safe, stay hydrated, and I'll see you tomorrow with, I believe, Mario and Luigi Superstar Saga with friends, or maybe more Death's Door. We'll find out. But until then, bye-bye!